The snow fell like ash from a dying fire, each flake a whisper of winter's cruel promise. Heather King pressed her swollen belly against the frosted window of the general store, watching the storm devour the last traces of the mountain road. 8 months pregnant and alone, she had nowhere left to run. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, bringing with him the bite of December wind and the scent of pine and desperation. Heather turned, her breath catching at the sight of the man who stumbled through the doorway. His clothes hung in tatters, patched with what looked like tree bark and strips of leather. His beard was wild and unkempt, his eyes hollow with a hunger that went deeper than food. But it was his hands that made her heart clench, the way they trembled as he approached the counter, the way his fingers traced the air above a loaf of bread as if he were afraid it might disappear. Quote zero, he whispered to the shopkeeper. His voice cracked from disuse. The shopkeeper, a thick-set man named Philip Murphy, looked the stranger up and down with obvious disgust. Quote two, the stranger's shoulders sagged. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small carved figure, a bear whittled from what looked like pine. The craftsmanship was exquisite, ever a detail lovingly rendered. This is all I have. My father taught me to carve. Please, I have not eaten in 3 days. Philip Murphy barely glanced at the carving before pushing it back across the counter. I am not interested in your trinkets. Buy something or get out. Heather watched the man's face crumble, watched him clutch the wooden bear to his chest like a lifeline. Something deep in her chest twisted, a pain that had nothing to do with the baby pressing against her ribs. She knew that look, that desperate hunger for kindness in a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. The stranger turned toward the door, his movement slow and defeated. As he passed her, Heather caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Pinned to the inside of his coat, barely visible through a tear in the fabric, was a photograph. Two small faces, identical, with the same hollow eyes as the man who carried their image. Quote 5. She called out, her voice stronger than she felt. The man stopped, his hand on the door handle. She moved to the counter, her hand already reaching for the coins in her coat pocket. The money was meant for her own supplies, for the journey ahead to her sister's house in the valley. But looking at this man, at the photograph of two children who shared his haunted expression, she knew she could not let him walk away empty-handed. How much for bread and some of that dried meat? She asked Philip Murphy, her eyes never leaving the stranger's face. Philip Murphy named his price, his tone suspicious. Heather counted out the coins, her fingers steady despite the trembling in her heart. It was more than she could afford, more than she should spend, but the image of those two small faces burned behind her eyelids. Quote, she added, placing the last of her money on the counter. Quote, the stranger's eyes widened, and for a moment Heather thought he might collapse. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words that would not come. When Philip Murphy grudgingly gathered the supplies and pushed them across the counter, the man stared at them as if they were made of gold. I cannot, he whispered, his voice breaking. I cannot accept this. You can, Heather said firmly, and you will. Those children need their father to come home. The man's eyes filled with tears that he tried desperately to hide. Taryn. Heather nodded toward the photograph visible through the tear in his coat. Quote 15, for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass. Inside the warm store, two strangers faced each other across a gulf of pain and understanding. Quote 16, the man said finally. Quote 17, quote 18, she replied, extending her hand. His grip was firm despite his weakness, calloused from hard work and harder living. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Wayne Bennett looked down at the supplies in his arms and then back at Heather's face. I do not know how I will ever repay you for this kindness. Just get home safely to your boys, Heather said. That will be payment enough. But as Wayne pushed through the door and disappeared into the swirling snow, Heather felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. Something in his eyes, a darkness deeper than hunger, told her that getting home would not be as simple as either of them hoped. The mountain had been Wayne Bennett's prison for 3 months, ever since the early snows had blocked the passes and trapped him in the high country. He had come up here in September, desperate for work after the mine closures had left half the territory unemployed. The logging camp had promised good wages and steady work through the winter, but the promises had proven as empty as his stomach. The camp foreman, a cruel man named Mark Sanders, had taken their pay and disappeared in the night, leaving 20 men stranded without supplies or wages. Most had tried to make it down the mountain before the worst of the weather hit. Wayne had stayed behind with a few others, hoping to salvage something from the abandoned equipment, something he could sell to feed his family. That decision had nearly cost him his life. The others had died one by one, claimed by cold and hunger and despair. Wayne had buried them in the frozen ground with his bare hands, each grave a reminder of how close he walked to the edge of oblivion. He had survived on pine needle tea and whatever small game he could catch, but the animals were scarce now, driven to ground by the brutal cold. The photograph in his coat was all that kept him going. Mark and Lewis, his twin boys, barely 4 years old. Their mother had died bringing them into the world, and Wayne had raised them alone, working whatever jobs he could find to keep them fed and warm. They were staying with his sister Amy Bailey in the valley town of Cedar Ridge, waiting for their father to return with the money that would see them through the winter. But Wayne had no money now, and winter was far from over. The bread Heather King had bought him lasted 2 days. The dried meat and milk stretched his meager supplies enough to give him strength for one final push down the mountain. But as he made his way through the treacherous passes, fighting through snowdrifts that reached his chest, Wayne knew he was racing against more than just the weather. Mark Sanders was still out there somewhere. Wayne had seen him 3 days ago, camped in a sheltered valley with 2 other men. They had supplies, warm clothes, and horses. They also had the money that belonged to Wayne and the other workers, money that Sanders had stolen before abandoning them to die. The sight of Sanders living in comfort while good men lay frozen in unmarked graves had filled Wayne with a rage that burned hotter than any fire. He had wanted to confront them, to demand what was rightfully his, but he was weak from hunger and outnumbered. Instead, he had watched from the shadows as they broke camp and headed down the mountain, following the same route he would need to take to reach Cedar Ridge. Now, as Wayne struggled through the snow with his meager supplies dwindling once again, he wondered if he would encounter Sanders again. The thought filled him with equal parts dread and anticipation. He needed that money, needed it desperately, but he was in no condition for a fight. The storm that had been building all day finally broke as Wayne reached the tree line. Wind howled through the pines, driving snow horizontally across the slope. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and Wayne knew he would have to find shelter or risk becoming another casualty of the mountain's indifference. He spotted a cabin through the swirling white, a small structure tucked into a grove of aspens. Smoke rose from its chimney, a welcome sign of warmth and life. Wayne stumbled toward it, his legs barely carrying him the final distance. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman with graying hair and kind eyes. She took one look at his condition and pulled him inside without a word. "Deborah Powell," she said, helping him to a chair by the fire, "and you look like a man who has been dancing with death." "Wayne Bennett," he managed, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "I am sorry to impose, but the storm—" "No imposition at all," Deborah said, already moving to ladle soup from a pot hanging over the fire. "I have been alone up here for 2 weeks, waiting for the weather to clear so I can get down to town. The company is welcome." Wayne accepted the bowl of soup gratefully, feeling life slowly return to his frozen limbs. Deborah Powell was a widow, she explained, who had come up to the mountains to settle her late husband's affairs at an old mining claim. Like Wayne, she had been caught by the early winter and forced to wait out the worst of the storms. "Quote 28, she said, settling into a chair across from him. "Quote 29, Wayne's blood chilled. "3 men, can you describe them?" Deborah's expression darkened. Quote 31, Mark Sanders. Wayne was certain of it. The scar was from a knife fight in a saloon, a story Sanders had told proudly during their time at the logging camp. If he had passed through here yesterday, he would be well ahead of Wayne on the trail to Cedar Ridge. Wayne asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Wait 30, Deborah said. Quote 34, Wayne's heart hammered against his ribs. Cedar Ridge was where Amy Bailey lived with his boys. If Sanders was heading there, it could only mean trouble. The man was vindictive enough to seek revenge against the families of the workers he had betrayed, especially if he thought they might cause problems for him. I have to get down there, Wayne said, starting to rise from his chair. Deborah placed a gentle hand on his arm. Not in this storm, you do not. You would be dead before you made it a mile. Rest tonight and we will see what morning brings. Wayne wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He was in no condition to travel in a blizzard, and getting himself killed would not help his boys. He spent the night pacing by the fire, staring out at the storm, and thinking of Mark and Louis sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware of the danger that might be approaching. Dawn brought a temporary lull in the storm, and Wayne knew it might be his only chance. Deborah Powell packed him what supplies she could spare and wished him luck. Her weathered face creased with worry. Be careful out there, she said as he prepared to leave. Those men yesterday, they had the look of killers about them. Wayne nodded grimly. He had seen that look in Sanders' eyes at the logging camp, the casual cruelty of a man who valued human life less than the coins in his pocket. The thought of such a man anywhere near his children filled Wayne with a desperate urgency that overrode his exhaustion. The trail down the mountain was treacherous, made worse by the fresh snow that concealed ice and loose rocks. Wayne moved as quickly as he dared, driven by the growing certainty that every minute of delay could cost him everything he held dear. He made good time despite his weakened condition, fueled by determination and the remnants of Deborah Powell's soup. But as the day wore on and the trail grew steeper, Wayne began to feel the effects of his ordeal. His vision blurred, his legs trembled with each step, and more than once he had to stop and lean against a tree to keep from collapsing. It was during one of these rest stops that he heard the voices. They came from below, carried on the thin mountain air. Wayne crept forward until he could see a small clearing where three men sat around a campfire. Even from a distance, he recognized Mark Sanders' bulk and the distinctive scar that marked his face. Quote 39, one of the other men was saying. Quote 40, Sanders spat into the fire, sending up a hiss of steam. Quote 12, the third man asked. Quote Sanders said, his voice carrying a note of cruel satisfaction. Quote Wayne's blood turned to ice in his veins. The casual way Sanders spoke of harming children, the obvious pleasure he took in the idea, confirmed Wayne's worst fears. This was not just about money or revenge. Sanders was a predator, and Wayne's boys were his prey. What about the sister? The second man asked. Amy Bailey. She might cause trouble. Sanders laughed, a sound like grinding glass. Let her try. We will deal with her too if we have to. Accidents happen all the time in winter. Wayne had heard enough. He began to back away from the clearing, his mind racing. Sanders and his men had at least a day's head start, and they were well rested and well supplied. Wayne was exhausted, half-starved, and alone. In a straight fight, he would not stand a chance. But he had one advantage they did not know about. Wayne knew these mountains better than most, having worked the logging camps and mining claims for years. There was another trail, steeper and more dangerous, that could get him to Cedar Ridge hours ahead of Sanders if he was willing to risk it. The Devil's Backbone, the locals called it. A narrow ridge that ran along the spine of the mountain, exposed to wind and weather, but offering the most direct route to the valley. In good conditions, it was treacherous. In winter, it was nearly suicidal. Wayne looked back at the clearing where Sanders and his men sat in comfort, planning the destruction of everything Wayne held dear. The choice was no choice at all. He turned toward the Devil's Backbone and began to climb. The ridge was worse than Wayne remembered. Wind howled across the exposed rock, driving snow and ice into his face with stinging force. The trail was barely wide enough for one person, with a sheer drop on either side that disappeared into swirling white. One wrong step, one moment of weakness, and he would fall into oblivion. But Wayne pressed on, driven by love and desperation in equal measure. He thought of Mark and Louis, their small faces bright with excitement whenever he returned from work. He thought of their laughter, their questions, their absolute trust that their father would always come home to them. He would not let them down. The wind grew stronger as Wayne made his way along the ridge, sometimes forcing him to his hands and knees to avoid being blown off the narrow path. His fingers were numb inside his worn gloves, and he could no longer feel his feet. But still he climbed, one step at a time, one breath at a time. It was near the highest point of the ridge that disaster struck. A gust of wind caught Wayne off guard just as he was stepping over a gap in the rock. His foot slipped on the ice and suddenly he was falling, his hands scrabbling desperately for purchase on the smooth stone. His left hand caught a small outcropping, arresting his fall but wrenching his shoulder with agonizing force. Wayne hung suspended over the abyss, his feet kicking uselessly in the empty air. Below him, the mountain dropped away into darkness. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. His strength was failing, his grip beginning to slip. It would be so easy to let go, to end the struggle and the pain. But then he thought of Heather King, the pregnant woman who had spent her last coins to feed a stranger. She had seen something worth saving in him, something worth the sacrifice. If she could show such kindness to someone she barely knew, how could he give up on his own children? Wayne gritted his teeth and began to pull himself up, inch by agonizing inch. His shoulder screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, but he forced them to obey. Slowly, impossibly, he hauled himself back onto the ridge. He lay there for a moment, gasping in the thin air, before forcing himself to his feet. The trail ahead looked even more treacherous than what he had already crossed, but Wayne no longer cared about the danger. Sanders was out there somewhere, moving steadily toward Cedar Ridge and the two small boys who trusted their father to protect them. Wayne would not let them down, even if it killed him. The descent from the Devil's Backbone was a nightmare of loose rock and hidden ice. Wayne's injured shoulder made every movement agony, but he pushed through the pain with grim determination. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson, he finally reached the tree line above Cedar Ridge. The town spread out below him like a collection of toy houses, smoke rising from chimneys into the still evening air. Somewhere down there, Mark and Lewis were probably having supper with their Aunt Amy, safe and warm and unaware of the danger approaching from the mountain. Wayne allowed himself a moment of relief. He had made it ahead of Sanders, but not by much. The easier trail that Sanders was following would bring him to town sometime after midnight, giving Wayne only a few hours to prepare. But prepare for what? Wayne was one man against three, weakened by hunger and injury. He had no weapons beyond a small knife, no allies beyond his sister, who knew nothing of the threat they faced. Sanders and his men were well-armed and ruthless, willing to harm children to achieve their goals. Wayne needed help, but who would believe his story? He was a ragged mountain man with wild tales of stolen wages and murderous foremen. Sanders, for all his cruelty, knew how to present himself as respectable when it suited his purposes. He would have a plausible story ready, some explanation for his presence in town that would deflect suspicion. As Wayne made his way down the slope towards Cedar Ridge, a plan began to form in his mind. It was desperate and dangerous, but it might be their only chance. He would need to reach Amy Bailey first, warn her of the danger, and then find a way to turn the tables on Sanders before the man could strike. The outskirts of Cedar Ridge were quiet as Wayne slipped between the buildings like a ghost. Most of the residents were inside, gathered around their fires against the winter cold. Wayne knew the town well from his visits to see the boys, knew which streets to avoid and which alleys would keep him hidden. Amy Bailey lived in a small house on the edge of town, a modest but comfortable home that she had inherited from her late husband. Wayne crept through her garden, noting with relief that warm light glowed in the windows. They were home and safe, at least for now. He tapped softly on the back door, not wanting to frighten the children. After a moment, he heard Amy's voice from within. "Who is there?" "It is Wayne," he called softly. "I need to speak with you. It is urgent." The door opened to reveal Amy Bailey's shocked face. She was a woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her expression shifted from surprise to concern as she took in Wayne's haggard appearance. "Wayne, what happened to you? You look terrible." "Where are the boys?" Wayne asked, pushing past her into the kitchen. "Asleep upstairs," Amy said, closing the door behind him. "Wayne, you are scaring me. What is wrong?" Wayne quickly explained everything that had happened, from the betrayal at the logging camp to his encounter with Sanders in the mountains. Amy's face grew pale as she listened, her hands clutching the back of a chair for support. She asked when he finished. Wayne said, quote 57. Amy sank into the chair, her face ashen. Quote 58. Wayne shook his head. Quote 59. Quote 60. Wayne was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he looked up at his sister with grim determination. Quote 60. Amy frowned. Quote 61, quote Thurston, Wayne explained. Quote Ironed, quote Wayne was about to answer when a small voice spoke from the doorway. Quote sound, Wayne turned to see Mark, one of his twin sons, standing in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt. The boy's face lit up with joy at the sight of his father, and he ran across the room to throw his arms around Wayne's legs. Quote sound, Mark said, his voice muffled against Wayne's coat. Lewis said you might not come back because of the snow, but I knew you would. Wayne knelt down and gathered his son into his arms, feeling tears sting his eyes. The boy was warm and solid and real, everything Wayne had fought so hard to protect. The scent of his hair, the sound of his breathing, the trust in his small hands as they gripped Wayne's shoulders, all of it reminded Wayne why he could not give up. Matishard, Wayne whispered. Quote bound, quote Sean, Mark asked, noticing the way Wayne favored his injured shoulder. Quote Sawyer, quote Sharon, Wayne said, forcing a smile. Quote Sorton, Lewis appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He was identical to his brother in every way except for a small scar on his chin from a childhood fall. Like Mark, he broke into a grin at the sight of his father and ran to join the embrace. Lewis said. Wayne laughed, the sound catching in his throat. Quote 78. The boys giggled, and for a moment Wayne allowed himself to forget about Sanders and the danger approaching from the mountain. This was what mattered, this warmth and love and innocence. This was what he had to protect, no matter the cost. But even as he held his sons close, Wayne's mind was working on the problem ahead. Sanders would be here soon, and when he arrived, Wayne would have to be ready. The lives of everyone he loved depended on it. A sound from outside made Wayne freeze. Footsteps in the snow, multiple sets, approaching the house with deliberate caution. Wayne looked at Amy, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. Sanders had arrived early. Wayne gently pushed the boys toward their aunt. Take them upstairs, he whispered urgently. Hide them into the back bedroom and do not come out no matter what you hear. Wayne, Amy started to protest. Go, Wayne said firmly. Now. Amy gathered the confused boys and hurried them toward the stairs. Wayne heard their footsteps on the wooden steps, then the soft sound of a door closing above. At least they would be out of immediate danger. Wayne moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 3 dark shapes were moving through the garden, approaching the house from different angles. Sanders was taking no chances, surrounding the building to prevent escape. Wayne stepped back from the window and tried to think. He was trapped, outnumbered, and weaponless, except for his small knife. Sanders and his men were armed and dangerous, willing to kill to protect their secrets. In a few moments, they would be at the door, and Wayne would have to face them with nothing but his wits and his desperate love for his family. The soft knock on the front door came like in a sentence. Wayne took a deep breath, squared his shoulders despite the pain, and walked toward whatever fate awaited him on the other side. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Wayne pressed his back against the wall beside the front door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Through the thin wood, he could hear the low murmur of voices, Sanders coordinating with his men. Wayne Bennett, Sanders called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake oil salesman. I know you are in there. We need to talk. Wayne said nothing, hoping against hope that Sanders might believe the house was empty. But the warm glow of lamplight through the windows betrayed their presence, and Sanders was not a man easily fooled. Come now, Wayne, Sanders continued, his tone growing harder. We have business to discuss, the kind of business that affects your family. The threat in those words made Wayne's blood run cold. He thought of Mark and Lewis upstairs, probably listening to every word with wide, frightened eyes. Amy would be holding them close, whispering reassurances she did not feel, trying to shield them from a danger they could not understand. Wayne moved to the kitchen window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. One of Sanders' men was positioned near the back door, rifle in hand. The man's face was hard and weathered, with the look of someone who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. Wayne recognized him from the logging camp, a drifter named Kevin Price who had attached himself to Sanders like a tick to a dog. Quote to 8. Sanders called from the front porch. Quote to 89. That was enough. Wayne could not let Sanders continue to threaten his children, even if it meant walking into a trap. He moved to the front door and placed his hand on the latch, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Quote 90, Wayne said loudly. Quote 91. Sanders laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Quote 92. Wayne knew there was nothing civilized about Mark Sanders, but he also knew he had no choice. He unlatched the door and stepped out into the cold night air, his hands raised to shoulder height. Sanders stood on the front porch with another of his men, both of them armed with rifles. The camp foreman looked exactly as Wayne remembered him, a big man with cruel eyes and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His companion was younger, barely out of his teens, with nervous energy and twitchy hands that spoke of inexperience and fear. Plus tard, Sanders said with mock friendliness. Sanires at Cutsman, and Wayne asked, keeping his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. Quote Sakta, Sanders replied, stepping closer. Quote 97. Quote Undine. Wayne said, though they both knew it was a lie. Sanders backhanded him across the face, the blow sending Wayne stumbling backward. The taste of blood filled his mouth, and his injured shoulder screamed in protest. Sanders snarled. Wayne spat blood into the snow. Quote Toinina, quote Uinumpan. Sanders said with a smile that never reached his eyes. Quote 103, Wayne said. Quote 103, Sanders' face darkened. You are trying my patience, Bennett. I could kill you right here and now. Make it look like an accident. Mountain Man freezes to death trying to get home to his family. Tragic, but these things happen. And then what? Wayne asked. My sister knows I was coming here. If I turn up dead, she will ask questions. Other people will start looking into what happened at the logging camp. Your sister will have her own problems to worry about, Sanders said coldly. Accidents happen to whole families sometimes. House fires in winter, carbon monoxide from a faulty stove. So many ways for good people to die. The casual way Sanders spoke of murdering children made Wayne's vision go red around the edges. He took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists, but the rifle barrels swinging toward him brought him up short. Sanders said, quote 111. Wayne stared at the man who held his family's lives in his hands, searching for any sign of humanity in those cold eyes. He found nothing but greed and cruelty, the soul of a predator who saw other human beings as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. How long do I have to decide? Wayne asked quietly. Until dawn, Sanders said. Pack what you can carry and be gone by sunrise. If you are still here when the sun comes up, my boys and I will pay a visit to your sister's house. I think you can imagine how that conversation will go. Sanders turned and walked away, his men falling into step behind him. Wayne watched them disappear into the darkness, their footsteps crunching in the snow until the night swallowed them completely. Wayne stood alone on the porch for a long moment, the cold seeping through his clothes and into his bones. The weight of the impossible choice pressed down on him like a physical thing. Stay and fight, and Sanders would kill his family. Run, and they would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, never knowing when the past would catch up with them. There had to be another way. Wayne slipped back into the house and climbed the stairs to the back bedroom where Amy was hiding with the boys. He found them huddled together on the bed, Amy's arms wrapped protectively around Mark and Lewis. The twins looked up at their father with one empty, bright, frightened eyes first. What did Lewis asked in a small voice, one Wayne said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Quote went and quote Mark said. Quote Wayne reached out and ruffled his son's hair. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, but everything is going to be all right. Amy caught his eye over the boys' heads, her expression asking the question she could not voice in front of the children. Wayne gave a slight shake of his head, and he saw her face go pale with understanding. Quote 121. Amy said gently, quote 122. The twins perked up at the mention of cookies and scrambled off the bed. Wayne listened to their footsteps on the stairs, waiting until he heard them in the kitchen before turning to his sister. Quote 123, he said without preamble. Quote 24. Amy's hand flew to her mouth. Wayne, we have to go to the sheriff. Surely the law can protect us. Wayne shook his head. Sanders has money and influence. He knows how to present himself as respectable. Who is going to believe a ragged mountain man over a successful businessman? Then what do we do? Wayne was quiet for a moment, thinking. There might be a way, he said finally, but it would be dangerous, and I would need help. What kind of help? Sanders thinks he holds all the cards, but he has made one mistake. He assumes I am alone and helpless. If we can change that assumption, we might be able to turn the tables on him." Amy frowned. "I do not understand." "Sanders wants to keep his crimes hidden," Wayne explained. "If we can threaten to expose him publicly, he might back down rather than risk everything he has stolen." "How do we do that?" Wayne stood and began pacing the small room. "We need allies, people in town who have influence, who Sanders cannot simply intimidate or kill without consequences." "Who did you have in mind?" "Judge Harrison, for one. He is an honest man, and he has the authority to order an investigation into what happened at the logging camp. Sheriff Coleman might help too, if we can convince him that Sanders is a threat to the town." Amy looked doubtful. "And you think they will believe our story?" "Not without proof," Wayne admitted. But I know where Sanders is camped, and I know he still has the money he stole from the workers. If we can get the sheriff to search his camp, find the evidence." "That is a big if," Amy said. "And what happens if it does not work? What if Sanders decides to kill us all rather than risk exposure?" Wayne stopped pacing and looked at his sister. "Then at least we will have tried. I will not run from this man, Amy. I will not spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when he will decide we are too much of a threat to live." Amy was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then she nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "Can you get word to Judge Harrison and Sheriff Coleman without Sanders knowing? Tell them to meet us at the church at midnight. Tell them it is a matter of life and death." "I think so. But Wayne, what if they refuse to come? What if they think this is some kind of trap?" "Then we try something else," Wayne said grimly. "But we have to start somewhere." Amy stood and smoothed down her skirt. "I will go now, while Sanders thinks we are just sitting here waiting for dawn. But Wayne, what about the boys? We cannot leave them alone." Wayne had been thinking about that too. "There is someone else we might be able to trust. Deborah Powell, the widow I met in the mountains. She said she was coming down to town to settle her husband's affairs. If she is here, she might be willing to watch the boys." "You think she can be trusted?" "She saved my life," Wayne said simply. "And she has no love for Sanders and his men. They robbed her when they passed through her cabin." Amy nodded. "I will look for her after I speak with the judge and sheriff." "What will you do?" "I am going to pay a visit to Sanders' camp," Wayne said. "See if I can find the evidence we need." Amy grabbed his arm. "Wayne, that is suicide. If they catch you, they will not catch me," Wayne said with more confidence than he felt. "I know these mountains, and I know how to move quietly. Besides, Sanders will not be expecting me to go on the offensive." Amy looked like she wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in her brother's eyes. Instead, she pulled him into a fierce embrace. "She whispered," Wayne said, holding her tight. They went downstairs together, where they found Mark and Lewis sitting at the kitchen table with milk mustaches and cookie crumbs scattered around them. The sight of their innocent faces, unmarked by the fear and violence that surrounded them, strengthened Wayne's resolve. "Boys," Amy said, kneeling beside their chairs, "I need to go out for a little while. Your father is going to take care of you." "Where are you going, Aunt Amy?" Mark asked. "Just to visit some friends," Amy said, forcing a smile. "I will be back soon." The boys accepted this explanation without question, as children do. Amy kissed them both on the forehead and gathered her coat and boots. She paused at the door, looking back at Wayne with worry in her eyes. "Midnight," Wayne reminded her quietly. Amy nodded and slipped out into the night, leaving Wayne alone with his sons. He sat with them while they finished their snack, listening to their chatter about the games they had played and the stories Amy had read to them. Their voices were like music to his ears, a reminder of everything pure and good in the world. When the boys began to yawn, Wayne carried them upstairs and tucked them into bed. He sat with them until their breathing grew slow and steady, watching their peaceful faces in the lamplight. They looked so small and vulnerable, so trusting in their father's ability to keep them safe. Wayne kissed each of them on the forehead and whispered a promise he prayed he would be able to keep. Then he slipped out of the room and prepared to venture back into the darkness. The night air bit at Wayne's exposed skin as he made his way through the back alleys of Cedar Ridge, moving like a ghost between the shadows. He had left the boys sleeping peacefully, trusting that Sanders would keep his word about waiting until dawn before making his move. It was a dangerous gamble, but Wayne had no choice. Sanders had made camp in a grove of pines about a mile outside of town, a sheltered spot that offered concealment and multiple escape routes. Wayne had spotted it earlier during his descent from the mountain, noting the glow of their campfire and the silhouettes of men and horses. The snow crunched softly under Wayne's feet as he worked his way through the forest, using every skill he had learned during his years in the mountains. He moved from tree to tree, pausing frequently to listen for any sound that might indicate he had been detected. The forest was quiet except for the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant hoot of an owl. As Wayne drew closer to the camp, he could smell wood smoke and hear the low murmur of voices. He crept forward until he could see the orange glow of the fire through the trees, then settled behind a fallen log to observe. Sanders and his two men were sitting around the fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey and talking in low tones. Their horses were picketed nearby, and Wayne could see several canvas bags stacked near Sanders' bedroll. If the stolen money was anywhere, it would be in those bags. "Should have just killed him at the house," Kevin Price was saying, his words slightly slurred from drink. "Would have saved us a lot of trouble." "Killing him is not the problem," Sanders replied, taking a swig from the bottle. "It is making sure no one comes looking for him afterward. Bennett has family, connections. We do this wrong, and we will have half the territory breathing down our necks." The younger man, who Wayne did not recognize from the logging camp, shifted nervously. "Maybe we should just take the money and run. Head south, start over somewhere else." Sanders laughed harshly. "And live like fugitives for the rest of our lives? No, thank you. We finish this here and now, clean and permanent. Then we can enjoy our newfound wealth in comfort." "What about the woman and the kids?" Price asked. "What about them?" Sanders shrugged. "Accidents happen, house fire, maybe, or carbon monoxide poisoning. Winter is dangerous for families living alone." The casual one they discussed murdering children made Wayne's stomach turn. He had heard enough to confirm his worst fears about Sanders' intentions, but he still needed evidence that would convince the authorities. The money in those bags would be a start, but he needed something more concrete. Wayne waited until the men had consumed more of the whiskey, their voices growing louder and their movements less coordinated. Then he began to work his way around the camp, staying well outside the circle of firelight. The horses nickered softly as he passed, but they were used to the scent of men and did not raise an alarm. Wayne crept closer to Sanders' bedroll, where the canvas bags lay in a neat pile. If he could get close enough to see what was inside one of them, it might provide the proof he needed. But as Wayne reached for the nearest bag, a hand fell on his shoulder like an iron trap. Quote 181, Kevin Price's voice drawled behind him. "Look what we have here." Wayne spun around, his hand going instinctively to his knife, but Price was already pointing a pistol at his chest. The man's eyes were bright with whiskey and malice. Quote 183, Price called toward the fire. Quote 24, Sanders looked up from the bottle, his face splitting into a cruel grin when he saw Wayne. Quote 108, quote Wayne said, keeping his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his heart. Quote 07, Sanders laughed. Quote Wayne said, quote Wayne. Sanders studied him for a moment, then gestured for Price to lower his weapon. Quote 191. Wayne took a careful breath, knowing that his next words might determine whether he lived or died. Quote 192, he said, nodding toward the bags of money. Quote 193. Quote 194, Sanders replied. Quote 195, quote 196 to Wayne said, Quote 7, quote Ananesh, Wayne met Sanders' eyes without flinching. Because I have something you want more than revenge. Information about where the other survivors from the camp went, the ones who made it down the mountain before the worst storms hit. It was a lie. But Wayne delivered it with conviction. Sanders' eyes narrowed with interest. Wayne continued. Sanders was quiet for a long moment, weighing Wayne's words. Wayne could see the greed warring with suspicion in the man's eyes, the desire for complete security battling against his natural distrust. Quote 203. Sanders said finally, quote Ovin, Wayne said, quote 206, quote 27, I quote, Wayne said, quote 209. Sanders picked up the whiskey bottle and took a long drink, considering. Wayne held his breath, knowing that his life hung in the balance of the man's decision. You know what I think, Sanders said finally. I think you are lying through your teeth. I think you came here hoping to steal back some of the money, maybe find evidence you could use against me. I think you are desperate and stupid and about to get yourself killed. Wayne's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. Sanders interrupted. Quote 242. The admission hit Wayne like a physical blow. Sanders had just confessed to multiple murders, but there was no one to hear it except Wayne and the killers themselves. Sanders continued with a cold smile. Wayne felt a rage building in his chest, hot and pure and dangerous. These men had murdered innocent people, stolen their wages, and left their families to wonder what had happened to them. Now they planned to do the same to Wayne's boys. You are a monster, Wayne said quietly. I am a businessman, Sanders corrected, and you are a problem that needs solving. Sanders nodded to Price, who raised his pistol again. Wayne tensed, preparing to dive for cover, but before Price could pull the trigger, a new voice cut through the night. Drop your weapons. Everyone turned toward the sound, and Wayne felt his heart leap with hope. Sheriff Coleman stepped into the circle of firelight, his rifle trained on Sanders. Behind him came Judge Harrison and two deputies, all armed and grim-faced. Sheriff Coleman, Sanders said with forced joviality, slowly raising his hands. What brings you out on such a cold night? Shut up, Sanders, Coleman replied. Wayne Bennett, step away from those men. Wayne did not need to be told twice. He moved quickly to the sheriff's side, relief flooding through him like warm water. Judge Harrison said, his voice cold with disgust. Quote 226. Sanders' face had gone pale, but his eyes still held their cunning gleam. You have no proof of anything. It is his word against ours. We have your confession, Coleman said, and we have these. He gestured toward the bags of money. I am willing to bet we will find the payroll from the logging camp in there, along with the personal effects of the men you murdered. For the first time since Wayne had known him, Mark Sanders looked genuinely afraid. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for an escape route, but the lawmen had positioned themselves to cut off any retreat. This is not over, Sanders said, his voice low and venomous. You think you have won, but you have no idea what you are dealing with. We are dealing with a coward and a killer, Judge Harrison replied. And justice has a long reach, Sanders. Longer than you think. As the deputies moved in to arrest Sanders and his men, Wayne felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had been carrying for months. The nightmare was finally over, and his family was safe. But even as the handcuffs clicked shut around Sanders' wrists, Wayne could not shake the feeling that the man's words carried the weight of prophecy. This might not be over after all. The arrest of Mark Sanders and his accomplices sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge. By dawn, word had spread throughout the small town that the respected businessman was actually a murderer and thief who had been terrorizing the mountain communities for months. Wayne sat in Sheriff Coleman's office, giving his formal statement, while Amy watched the twins in the waiting area outside. The boys had slept through the night's drama, waking to find their father safely returned and their Aunt Amy making breakfast as if nothing else had happened. You did good work last night, Bennett, Sheriff Coleman said, setting down his pen after recording the last of Wayne's testimony. Quote 236. Quote Tortred, Wayne had replied, thinking of his sister's courage in approaching the judge and sheriff in the middle of the night. Amy Bailey deserves the credit for convincing you to listen. Coleman nodded. She is a persuasive woman. Told us you were in mortal danger and that innocent children were at risk. That was enough to get us moving. Judge Harrison looked up from the ledger he had been examining, his face grim. The records we found in Sanders' possessions tell a terrible story. 23 men dead, their wages stolen, their families left to wonder what happened to them. This goes far beyond what we initially suspected. Wayne felt a chill run down his spine. 23? The logging camp was just the beginning, Harrison continued. Sanders has been running this operation for over a year, targeting remote work sites where men go missing without anyone asking too many questions. Mining camps, railroad crews, lumber operations. He would take a job as foreman, then disappear with the payroll after eliminating any witnesses. How did he get away with it for so long? Wayne asked. Money and influence, Coleman replied bitterly. Sanders had connections in the territorial government, people who were willing to look the other way in exchange for a share of the profits. We are going to have to dig deep to root out all of his accomplices. Wayne thought about the men he had worked beside at the logging camp, good men with families who were counting on them to come home. Now those families would never see their loved ones again, would never know what had happened to them. What about the families of the victims? Wayne asked. Do they know what happened? I will be sending word to them, Harrison said, and we will be returning what money we can recover. It will not bring back their loved ones, but at least they will have some closure. Wayne nodded, though he knew that no amount of money could ease the pain of losing a husband or father. He had come close to leaving his own boys orphaned, and the thought still made his hands shake. There is one more thing, Coleman said, his expression serious. Sanders has been talking since we locked him up, making threats, claiming he has friends who will not let this stand. I want you and your family to be careful for the next few weeks. You think he might try something from jail? Wayne asked. I think a man like Sanders does not work alone, Coleman replied. He had to have partners, people who helped him move the money and cover his tracks. Some of them are still out there, and they might decide you are a threat to their operation. Wayne felt the familiar weight of fear settle on his shoulders. Just when he thought the nightmare was over, it seemed like it was only beginning. What do you suggest I do? Stay close to town, Coleman advised. Keep your eyes open and do not hesitate to come to me if you see anything suspicious. We will be keeping a close watch on Sanders and his men, but I cannot guarantee that all of his associates have been caught. Wayne left the sheriff's office with more questions than answers. The immediate threat was over, but the larger conspiracy that Sanders had been part of was still out there, lurking in the shadows like a wolf waiting to strike. Amy was waiting for him with the boys, who were playing with wooden toys that Judge Harrison had given them from his own grandchildren's collection. Mark and Lewis looked up at their father with bright smiles, blissfully unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. Papa, Lewis said, running to wrap his arms around Wayne's legs. Quote 261. Wayne knelt down and gathered both boys into his arms, breathing in the scent of their hair and feeling the solid warmth of their small bodies. Quote 27, he said. Quote 2 should a quote Mark asked him. Quote Sharon. Wayne looked at his son's earnest face, seeing hope and trust in those dark eyes. I am staying, he promised. No more mountain work for me. It was a promise he intended to keep, though he had no idea how he would support his family without the dangerous but well-paying jobs in the high country. The money from the logging camp was gone, stolen by Sanders, and Wayne had no other skills that would pay enough to keep his boys fed and clothed. But those were problems for tomorrow. Today he was alive and his family was safe, and that was enough. Amy linked her arm through his as they walked home through the snow-covered streets of Cedar Ridge. What will you do now? She asked quietly, echoing his own thoughts. I do not know, Wayne admitted. Find work somewhere, I suppose. Maybe we could move to the territorial capital. Start fresh where no one knows our story. You are welcome to stay with me as long as you need, Amy said. The boys love it here, and I love having them around. This house has been too quiet since my husband died. Wayne squeezed her arm gratefully. Thank you, but I need to find a way to support them myself. I will not be a burden on your kindness forever. You could never be a burden, Amy said firmly. You are family. As they approached Amy's house, Wayne noticed a figure sitting on the front porch, bundled in a heavy coat against the cold. As they drew closer, he recognized Deborah Powell, the widow who had sheltered him during his flight down the mountain. Wayne called out, quickening his pace. Quote 276. Deborah stood as they approached, her weathered face creased with concern. Quote 7, she said. Quote 20, Wayne replied. Quote 1, Deborah waved away his gratitude. Quote 10, she looked at Mark and Lewis, who were hiding shyly behind their father's legs. These must be your boys. They are beautiful children. Mark and Lewis, Wayne said, gently encouraging them forward. Boys, this is Mrs. Powell. She helped Papa get home safely. The twins stepped forward and offered polite greetings, their manners impeccable despite their bashfulness. Deborah smiled at them warmly, and Wayne could see the maternal instinct in her eyes. I actually came to town for another reason, Deborah said, turning back to Wayne. I have a proposition that might interest you. Wayne raised an eyebrow. What kind of proposition? My late husband left me a small ranch about 10 miles south of here, Deborah explained. Nothing fancy, just a house and some grazing land. I have been trying to decide what to do with it, and after meeting you, I think I might have found an answer. I do not understand, Wayne said. The place needs work, Deborah continued. The house needs repairs, the fences need mending, and the land needs someone who knows how to work it properly. I could hire men to do the work, but I would rather have someone I trust living there, taking care of it like it was their own. Wayne felt his heart begin to race. Are you offering me a job? I am offering you a partnership, Deborah said. You work the land, fix up the property, and in return you and your boys have a place to live and a share of whatever the ranch produces. It will not make you rich, but it will give you independence and a chance to build something for your children. Wayne stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. After months of struggle and desperation, after coming so close to losing everything, someone was offering him hope. Why, he asked. Why would you trust me with something so valuable? Deborah smiled, and for a moment her weathered face looked years younger. Because when you were starving and desperate, you still had the strength to help someone else. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Wayne felt tears sting his eyes, and he had to clear his throat before he could speak. I accept, he said, and I promise you will not regret this decision. I know I will not, Deborah replied. Now, shall we go inside and discuss the details? I have a feeling we have a lot to talk about. As they walked toward the house, Wayne felt something he had not experienced in months. Hope. Real, tangible hope for the future. His boys would have a home, a place to grow up safe and secure. He would have work that mattered, a chance to build something lasting. But even as optimism filled his heart, Wayne could not shake Sheriff Coleman's warning about Sanders' associates. The immediate danger might be over, but the larger threat was still out there waiting in the shadows. For now, though, Wayne chose to focus on the light instead of the darkness. His family was safe. He had found an ally in Deborah Powell, and tomorrow would bring new possibilities. It was enough to build a future on. 3 days after Sanders' arrest, Wayne was loading supplies into a borrowed wagon when he noticed the stranger watching him from across the street. The man was well-dressed in a dark coat and bowler hat, with the soft look of someone who spent his time in offices rather than outdoors. But his eyes were hard and calculating as they followed Wayne's movements. Wayne pretended not to notice as he continued loading tools and provisions for the move to Deborah Powell's ranch. Amy was helping him, while the twins played in the snow nearby, their laughter ringing out in the crisp morning air. What 3 Amy said quietly, quote 3 or. Wayne glanced over casually, confirming what he had already suspected. The stranger was still there, making no attempt to hide his interest in Wayne's activities. Never seen him before, Wayne replied, though something about the man's bearing reminded him of the territorial officials Sanders had mentioned. Quote 306. They worked faster, loading the last of their belongings into the wagon. Wayne helped the boys climb up onto the seat, then took the reins himself. As they pulled away from Amy's house, Wayne noticed the stranger step into the street and flag down a passing rider. Within minutes, the rider was galloping out of town in the same direction Wayne was heading. What is wrong, Papa? Mark asked, noticing the tension in his father's shoulders. Quote 308, Wayne said, though his eyes never stopped scanning the road ahead. Quote 309. The journey to Deborah Powell's property took them through rolling hills covered in snow, past stands of aspen and pine that sparkled in the winter sunlight. Under normal circumstances, Wayne would have enjoyed the peaceful beauty of the landscape, but the knowledge that they were being followed cast a shadow over everything. Wayne had chosen a route that would take them past Sheriff Coleman's jurisdiction and into the next county, hoping to put some distance between his family and whatever remained of Sanders' organization. But if the stranger in town was connected to Sanders, that distance might not be enough. The ranch appeared as they crested a small hill, a modest collection of buildings nestled in a sheltered valley. The main house was a simple log structure with a stone chimney, while a barn and several outbuildings completed the homestead. It was not much to look at, but to Wayne it represented something precious, a chance at a new beginning. Deborah Powell was waiting for them on the front porch, a welcoming smile on her weathered face. She had arrived the day before to prepare the house and make sure everything was ready for their arrival. Welcome to your new home, she called out as Wayne brought the wagon to a stop. The boys tumbled out of the wagon and ran toward the house, their excitement infectious. Wayne watched them explore their new surroundings with the boundless energy of children, and for a moment he allowed himself to forget about the dangers that might be following them. The house is in better shape than I expected, Wayne said, as he began unloading their belongings. Your husband took good care of this place. He loved this land, Deborah replied, a note of sadness in her voice. Always said it had good bones, just needed someone with vision to make it prosper. They spent the afternoon settling in, arranging furniture and unpacking supplies. The house was small but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a main room dominated by a large stone fireplace. Wayne could already see improvements that needed to be made, but the basic structure was sound. As evening approached, Wayne found himself standing at the kitchen window, looking out over the valley. The view was peaceful and serene, but he could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. You are worried about something, Deborah observed, joining him at the window. Wayne nodded. There was a man in town today watching us. I think he might be connected to Sanders. What kind of man? Well-dressed, official-looking, the type who works behind a desk and gives orders to others. Deborah frowned. That does not sound good. Do you think we should contact the sheriff? We are outside Coleman's jurisdiction now, Wayne replied, and I do not know if the local law can be trusted. Sanders mentioned having friends in the territorial government. They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Then Deborah straightened her shoulders with the determination of someone who had faced hardship before. Well, she said, whatever comes, we will face it together. This land has weathered storms before, and it will weather them again. Wayne looked at her with newfound respect. Deborah Powell might be a widow living alone, but she had the strength of someone who had learned to rely on herself. Having her as an ally gave him confidence that they could handle whatever threats emerged. That night, Wayne lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling around him. Mark and Lewis were sleeping peacefully in the small bedroom they shared, their breathing slow and steady. Through the thin walls, he could hear Deborah moving around in her own room, probably unable to sleep as well. It was near midnight when Wayne heard the first sound that did not belong. A soft crunch of snow outside, too deliberate to be an animal. Wayne slipped out of bed and crept to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. 3 dark figures were moving through the yard, approaching the house from different angles. They moved with military precision, coordinating their approach to surround the building. Wayne could see the glint of weapons in the moonlight. Wayne's blood ran cold. Sanders' associates had found them. He crept to Deborah's room and tapped softly on the door. She opened it immediately, already dressed and alert. Quote 324, she whispered. Quote 35, Wayne replied. Quote Trixon, Deborah nodded grimly. Quote Travelin, quote Drawlin, Wayne protested. Quote Tron, Deborah said firmly. Quote Darnon, before Wayne could argue further, a voice called out from the yard. Quote 331, the voice was cultured and educated, with the accent of someone from back east. Wayne recognized it as belonging to the well-dressed stranger who had been watching them in town. Wayne called back through the door. Quote, Anda, the stranger replied. Quote, Where's? Wayne knew it was a lie. These men had not come all this way just to talk. They were here to eliminate the threat that Wayne represented to whatever remained of Sanders' organization. Give me a minute to get dressed, Wayne called back, stalling for time. He hurried to the boys' room and gently shook them awake. The twins rubbed their eyes sleepily, but followed their father without complaint. Wayne led them to the kitchen, where Deborah was already opening a trapdoor that led to the root cellar below. Wayne whispered to his sons. Otai quotes free now, Lewis whispered. Wayne knelt down and pulled both boys close. Quote thwarting. The boys nodded solemnly, and Wayne helped them down into the cellar. Deborah handed him a shotgun that had been hidden behind the kitchen door. She said simply. Wayne checked the weapon and nodded his thanks. Then he moved to the front door, his heart pounding against his ribs. Quote 342, he called to the men outside. Wayne opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the shotgun held ready, but not quite pointed at the strangers. In the moonlight, he could see the well-dressed man from town standing near the wagon, flanked by 2 rough-looking companions. The man said with false politeness. Wayne frowned. Kevin Price was the name of one of Sanders' men, but this was not the same person. This man was older, more refined, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. I think you have me confused with someone else, Wayne said carefully. "Oh, I do not think so," Price replied. "You see, my associate Kevin Price was arrested along with Mark Sanders, thanks to your interference. That has caused considerable inconvenience to our organization." So there were two Kevin Prices, Wayne realized. The rough drifter who had been arrested with Sanders, and this man, who was clearly higher up in the criminal hierarchy. "I do not know what you are talking about," Wayne said. Price smiled coldly. "Please, Mr. Bennett, let us not insult each other's intelligence. You cost us a great deal of money and several valuable associates. That cannot go unanswered." "Sanders was a murderer and a thief," Wayne said. "He got what he deserved." "Mark Sanders was a useful tool," Price corrected. "Nothing more. His arrest is an inconvenience, but not a disaster. However, your continued existence represents a threat to operations that are far more important than one logging camp." Wayne tightened his grip on the shotgun. "What do you want?" "Initially, we just wanted you dead," Price said conversationally. "Quick, clean, permanent. But then we realized that you might be more valuable alive." "How so?" "You know these mountains better than most," Price explained. "You have contacts in the mining and logging communities. People who trust you. That makes you potentially useful to our organization." Wayne felt his stomach turn. "You want me to help you rob and murder innocent people?" "I want you to help us identify profitable opportunities," Price said. "Nothing more violent than that, at least initially. In return, your family lives, and you receive a generous share of the profits. And if I refuse," Price gestured toward the house, "then your sons become orphans tonight, and your friend, Mrs. Powell, suffers an unfortunate accident. These things happen in remote locations." Wayne looked at the two men flanking Price, noting their weapons and the casual way they held them. He was outnumbered and outgunned, with his children hiding in the cellar just yards away. But even as fear clawed at his chest, Wayne felt something else rising to meet it. Anger. Pure, clean anger at men who would threaten children to get what they wanted. "I need time to think about it," Wayne said. "Of course," Price replied. "You have until dawn to decide. Choose wisely, Mr. Bennett. There will not be a second chance, all right?" The three men melted back into the darkness, leaving Wayne alone on the porch with his racing thoughts and the weight of an impossible choice. Wayne stood on the porch long after the men had disappeared, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The shotgun felt heavy in his hands, though he knew it would be useless against three armed men who had the advantage of darkness and position. Behind him, the door opened quietly, and Deborah Powell stepped out, her own rifle cradled in her arms. "They are gone?" she asked in a low voice. "For now," Wayne replied, "but they will be back at dawn for my answer." "What kind of answer are they expecting?" Wayne told her about Price's offer, watching her face grow grim as he explained the choice he had been given. When he finished, Deborah was quiet for a long moment. "She said finally," Wayne said. Wayne looked out over the moonlit valley, his mind racing through possibilities. They could try to run, but Price's men would be watching the roads. They could try to fight, but the odds were hopeless. They could surrender and hope for mercy from men who had already proven they had none. Or they could try something else entirely. "How well do you know this valley?" Wayne asked. "Like the back of my hand," Deborah replied. "I have been coming here since I was a girl." "Wait, are there any places where a small group could hide? Caves, abandoned buildings, anything that might provide shelter?" Deborah thought for a moment. "There is an old mine shaft about 2 miles north of here. It was abandoned years ago when the vein played out, but the tunnels are still stable, and there is a line cabin up in the hills that the previous owner used during roundups." Wayne nodded slowly. A plan was beginning to form in his mind, desperate and dangerous, but possibly their only chance. "How long would it take to reach the mine shaft on foot?" he asked. "An hour, maybe less if we pushed hard. But Wayne, you cannot be thinking of hiding there with the boys. It would be freezing, and if those men found us, we would be trapped." "Not hiding," Wayne said, "drawing them away from you and the boys." Deborah stared at him. "That is suicide." "Maybe," Wayne admitted, "but it is better than the alternatives." They went back inside, where Wayne carefully lifted the trapdoor and called softly to his sons. Mark and Lewis climbed out of the root cellar, their faces pale but brave. "Are the bad men gone, Papa?" Mark asked. "For now," Wayne said, kneeling to their level, "but I need you boys to be very brave for me. Mrs. Powell is going to take you somewhere safe, while I take care of some business. I want to stay with you, Lewis said, his lower lip trembling. Wayne pulled both boys close, breathing in their familiar scent and trying to memorize the feel of their small bodies in his arms. I know you do, but the most important thing you can do right now is keep each other safe. Can you do that from far me? The twins nodded solemnly, though Wayne could see the fear in their eyes. He hated putting them through this, hated that his past had caught up with them in this way. But he would do whatever it took to protect them. Mrs. Powell, Wayne said, standing up, can you get them to the line cabin without being seen? I think so, Deborah replied. There is a deer trail that runs along the ridge. It is rough going, but it would keep us off the main paths. How long to get there? 2 hours, maybe 3 with the boys. Wayne nodded. That would give him enough time to implement his plan, assuming it worked at all. Take them there and wait, he instructed. If I do not come for you by tomorrow night, head for Cedar Ridge and find Sheriff Coleman. Tell him what happened here. Wayne, Deborah said, her voice thick with emotion, there has to be another way. If there is, I cannot see it, Wayne replied. These men will not give up, and they will not negotiate in good faith. The only way to stop them is to make them think they have won, then turn the tables on them. Wayne spent the next hour preparing for what might be his final confrontation. He gathered supplies and weapons, checked and rechecked his plan for flaws, and tried not to think about the possibility that he might never see his sons again. As Deborah prepared to leave with the boys, Wayne knelt down one more time to say goodbye. Listen to Mom, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. No matter what happens, I want you to remember that your papa loves you more than anything in this world. You are good boys, brave boys, and you are going to grow up to be fine men. Papa, Mark said, tears streaming down his face. Please do not go. Wayne felt his own eyes fill with tears, but he forced himself to remain strong for his sons. I have to, but I promise you, I will do everything I can to come back to you. He kissed each boy on the forehead, then stood and watched as Deborah led them out into the darkness. Their small figures disappeared into the trees, and Wayne felt a piece of his heart go with them. Now he was alone with his plan and his determination to see it through. Wayne spent the remaining hours before dawn setting his trap. He moved through the house and outbuildings, placing kerosene-soaked rags and other flammable materials in strategic locations. If Price's men wanted to search the property, they would find more than they bargained for. He also prepared several surprises in the barn and root cellar, using his knowledge of explosives gained during his mining days. The charges were small but positioned to cause maximum confusion and disorientation. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, Wayne took his position in the loft of the barn. From there, he could see the entire yard and the approaches to the house. The shotgun was loaded and ready, and he had a clear line of sight to his primary targets. Right on schedule, 3 figures emerged from the tree line and approached the house. Price walked in front, his expensive coat making him easy to identify in the growing light. His 2 companions flanked him, their weapons drawn and ready. Price called out. Wayne remained silent, watching as the men spread out to surround the house. They were being cautious, probably expecting some kind of resistance. Quote 442. Price called again, his voice carrying a note of irritation. Quote 414. When there was still no response, Price nodded to his men. They approached the house from different angles, moving with the practiced efficiency of experienced killers. The first man reached the front door and tried the handle. Finding it unlocked, he pushed it open and stepped inside. Wayne counted slowly to 10, then triggered the first of his surprises. The explosion was not large, but it was loud enough to shake the house and send the man stumbling back outside, his face blackened with soot and his eyebrows singed. Quote 414, Price shouted, drawing his own weapon. The second man tried the back door with similar results, though this explosion was smaller and designed more for disorientation than damage. By now, Price and his men were fully alert and angry. Quote 416, one of the men shouted, pointing toward Wayne's position. Wayne smiled grimly. That was exactly what he wanted them to think. The 3 men converged on the barn, their weapons ready. Wayne waited until they were in position, then triggered his final surprise. The charges he had placed around the barn's foundation were not designed to bring down the building, but to create enough smoke and confusion to mask his movements. As the explosions went off in sequence, filling the air with dust and debris, Wayne slipped out through a hole he had cut in the back wall of the loft. By the time Price and his men fought their way through the smoke to search the barn, Wayne was already moving through the forest toward the abandoned mine shaft. Behind him, he could hear shouts of anger and confusion as the men realized they had been tricked. Wayne's plan was working, but the hardest part was still ahead. He had to reach the mine shaft and prepare his final stand, knowing that when Price and his men caught up with him, only one side would walk away alive. As Wayne ran through the snow-covered forest, dodging between trees and leaping over fallen logs, he thought about Mark and Lewis safe in the line cabin with Deborah Powell. Whatever happened next, at least his boys had a chance. That was all any father could ask for. The mine shaft yawned before Wayne like the mouth of some ancient beast, its timber supports weathered gray by decades of mountain storms. He paused at the entrance and listening for the sounds of pursuit behind him. Through the trees, he could hear Price and his men crashing through the underbrush, their angry voices carrying on the thin morning air. Wayne had perhaps 10 minutes before they found his trail, 10 minutes to prepare for what would likely be his final stand. The abandoned mine tunneled deep into the mountainside, its main shaft supported by rotting timbers that groaned ominously in the wind. Wayne had worked mines like this before, knew their dangers and their possibilities. The tunnels branched off in several directions, creating a maze that could confuse pursuers or trap the unwary. But Wayne was not planning to hide in the depths. He had something else in mind. He moved quickly through the entrance chamber, gathering the materials he needed. Old mining equipment lay scattered about, rusted and forgotten. Coils of rope, picks, and shovels, and most importantly, several cases of blasting powder that had been left behind when the mine was abandoned. Wayne worked with practiced efficiency, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He positioned charges at key support points throughout the entrance chamber, running fuses back to a central detonator. If Price and his men wanted to corner him in here, they would find the mountain itself fighting against them. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the rock walls. Wayne finished his preparations and took position behind a pile of ore carts, his shotgun ready. Through the mine entrance, he could see three dark silhouettes approaching cautiously. "Bennett," Price called out, his cultured voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "This is foolish. You are trapped in there with nowhere to run." Wayne remained silent, watching as the three men positioned themselves at the mouth of the tunnel. They were being careful, probably expecting another trap like the ones at the ranch. "We know you are in there," Price continued, "and we know you have nowhere else to go. Come out now and we can still reach an accommodation." One of Price's men, a lean fellow with nervous eyes, stepped closer to the entrance. Quote 421 pound, quote 422 pound, Price said with certainty, and quote 423 pound. The lean man took another step forward, then another. Wayne could see him clearly now in the dim light filtering through the entrance. The man's rifle was raised and ready, his finger on the trigger. Wayne waited until the man was fully inside the mine shaft, then spoke quietly. "You are right, I am here." The man spun toward the sound of Wayne's voice, but Wayne was already moving. The shotgun boomed in the confined space, the sound deafening. The lean man went down hard, his rifle clattering across the rocky floor. Quote 425, Price shouted from outside. Quote 426. There was no response from the fallen man. Wayne could hear Price and his remaining companion arguing in harsh whispers, trying to decide their next move. Quote 427. The second man was saying, quote, Winston, Price replied. Quote, Wayne heard the sound of metal on stone, then the acrid smell of burning fuse. They were throwing dynamite into the mine, trying to bring down the entrance and bury him alive. Wayne smiled grimly. He had been counting on their impatience. The dynamite exploded near the entrance, sending rock and debris flying. But Wayne's own charges were positioned deeper in the mine, where the blast would have maximum effect on the tunnel's structural integrity. As the dust from the first explosion began to settle, Wayne triggered his own surprise. The mountain groaned like a living thing as Wayne's charges detonated in sequence. Support timbers snapped like matchsticks, and tons of rock began to shift and slide. The mine shaft shuddered, then began to collapse from the inside out. Wayne ran deeper into the tunnel as the ceiling came down behind him, sealing off the main entrance but leaving him trapped in the darkness. It was a desperate gamble, betting his life that there was another way out of the mine. Behind him, he could hear Price screaming orders at his surviving companion, their voices muffled by the fallen rock. They would try to dig through, but it would take hours or even days. By then, Wayne hoped to be long gone. The secondary tunnel Wayne remembered from his mining days was narrow and treacherous, barely wide enough for one man to crawl through. But it connected to an old ventilation shaft that emerged on the far side of the mountain, hidden among a cluster of boulders. Wayne made his way through the cramped passage by feel, his hands bleeding from the rough stone. The air was thick with dust and the smell of his own fear, but he pressed on. Somewhere above him, Mark and Lewis were waiting with Deborah Powell, trusting their father to return to them. He would not let them down. The ventilation shaft was a nightmare of loose rock and rotting timbers, but Wayne climbed steadily upward, driven by love and desperation in equal measure. His injured shoulder screamed in protest with every movement, but he ignored the pain. Physical suffering was nothing compared to the thought of his sons growing up without their father. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Wayne saw a circle of gray sky above him. The shaft opened onto a narrow ledge hidden among the rocks, invisible from below but offering a clear view of the valley. Wayne hauled himself out of the hole and lay gasping on the cold stone, his body shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. But he was alive, and he was free. From his vantage point, he could see the mine entrance far below, where Price and his remaining man were frantically trying to clear the rockfall. They would be at it for hours, giving Wayne time to reach the line cabin and collect his family. But as Wayne started to rise, a new sound reached his ears. Horses, moving fast along the valley floor. A lot of horses. Wayne crept to the edge of the ledge and peered down. A column of riders was approaching the mine, at least a dozen men wearing the badges of territorial marshals. At their head rode a familiar figure that made Wayne's heart leap with hope. Sheriff Coleman had arrived with reinforcements. Wayne watched as the lawmen surrounded the mine entrance, cutting off any escape route for Price and his companion. There was a brief exchange of gunfire, then silence. When the dust settled, both of Price's men were in custody, their hands bound and their weapons confiscated. But Price himself was nowhere to be seen. Wayne scanned the area below, searching for any sign of the well-dressed criminal who had threatened his family. It was possible that Price had been killed in the rockfall, but Wayne doubted it. Men like Price did not die easily, and they always had an escape plan. As if summoned by his thoughts, Wayne heard the soft scrape of boot leather on stone behind him. He turned slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his knife. Kevin Price stood at the far end of the ledge, his expensive coat torn and dirty, but his eyes still cold with malice. In his hand was a small but deadly derringer, its barrel pointed directly at Wayne's chest. Price said with his usual false politeness, quote 432, quote 433. Wayne replied, rising slowly to his feet, quote 434. Price smiled thinly. Quote 435, quote 436, Wayne said. Quote 437. Price mused. Quote Fradsem. Wayne's blood turned to ice. You know where they are? I know everything that happens in these mountains, Price said. Did you really think you could hide from me? I have been planning this operation for months, mapping every trail and every hiding place. Wayne took a careful step sideways, trying to put himself between Price and the path that led toward the line cabin. What do you want? What I have always wanted, Price had replied. Your cooperation. Work with me and your family lives. Continue to oppose me, and they die slowly while you watch. The marshals have your men, Wayne pointed out. Your organization is finished. Price laughed, the sound echoing off the rocks. Those men were expendable. Sanders was expendable. Even I am expendable, if necessary. The organization is much larger than you imagine, Mr. Bennett. We have operations throughout the territory and resources you cannot begin to comprehend. Then why do you need me? Because you have become a symbol, Price said. The man who brought down Mark Sanders. If word spreads that you can be intimidated or eliminated, it might encourage others to interfere with our business. But if you join us willingly, it sends a different message entirely. Wayne understood now. This was not just about revenge or even practical concerns. This was about perception, about maintaining the fear that kept Price's organization in power. Wayne asked, Wayne looked into Price's cold eyes and saw nothing but calculation and cruelty. This man would kill children without hesitation, would destroy innocent lives to protect his criminal empire. But Wayne also saw something else: desperation. Price was talking too much, explaining too much. Men who were confident in their victory did not need to justify themselves to their victims. "You are afraid," Wayne said suddenly. Price's smile faltered slightly. Quote 454. Quote 455. Wayne repeated, taking another step sideways. Quote 456 to quote 457 on, Price said, but Wayne could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Quote 458. Wayne continued, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Quote 459. Price's mask of civility was beginning to slip. "You are grasping at straws, Bennett." "Am I?" Wayne asked. "Then why are you here alone? Where are your backup men, your escape routes? A man like you does not operate without multiple contingency plans unless something has gone very wrong." The derringer in Price's hand trembled slightly, confirming Wayne's suspicions. The criminal was trapped, just as Wayne had been, with nowhere left to run. "It does not matter," Price said, his voice hardening. "I still have the gun, and you still have family to protect. Make your choice, Bennett. Join me or watch them die." Wayne looked at the weapon pointed at his chest, then at the narrow ledge that offered no room for maneuver. Below them, he could hear the marshals organizing their search, but they were too far away to help. This was it, the moment when everything would be decided. Wayne thought of Mark and Lewis, probably playing in the snow outside the line cabin while Deborah Powell kept watch. They trusted their father to come back to them, trusted him to keep them safe. He could not let them down. "All right," Wayne said quietly, "I will do it." Price's eyes lit up with triumph. Wayne said, taking a step toward Price. The criminal relaxed slightly, lowering the derringer just a fraction. It was the opening Wayne had been waiting for. Wayne lunged forward, his hand closing around Price's wrist. The two men grappled on the narrow ledge, fighting for control of the weapon. Price was soft from years of comfortable living, but desperation gave him strength. The derringer fired, the bullet ricocheting off the rocks with a sharp whine. Wayne twisted Price's wrist, trying to force him to drop the gun, but the criminal held on with the tenacity of a man fighting for his life. They rolled across the ledge, dangerously close to the edge. Below them was a sheer drop of hundreds of feet, ending in jagged rocks and certain death. Price managed to break free and scramble backward, raising the derringer again. But in his haste, he misjudged the distance to the edge. Wayne watched in horrified fascination as Price's foot found empty air. The criminal's eyes widened in shock and terror as he realized his mistake. He clawed desperately at the rock, but there was nothing to grab onto. Kevin Price fell without a sound, his expensive coat fluttering behind him like broken wings. Wayne forced himself to look away before the body hit the rocks below. It was over. Wayne sat on the ledge for a long moment, his hands shaking as the adrenaline slowly drained from his system. The threat to his family was finally ended. The criminal organization that had terrorized the territory was broken. But there was no satisfaction in victory, only exhaustion and relief. The sound of approaching voices brought Wayne back to the present. The marshals had heard the gunshot and were climbing toward his position. Soon they would want explanations, statements, and testimony about everything that had happened. But first, Wayne had a promise to keep. The line cabin sat in a grove of aspen trees, its weathered logs almost invisible against the winter landscape. Smoke rose from its chimney, a welcome sign of warmth and life that made Wayne's heart race with anticipation. He had left the marshals at the mine, promising to give his full statement once he had seen to his family's safety. Sheriff Coleman had understood, having children of his own, and had agreed to handle the immediate aftermath of Price's death. Wayne approached the cabin cautiously, not wanting to frighten the occupants. Through the small window, he could see movement inside, the familiar silhouettes of his sons playing near the fireplace. He knocked softly on the door, using the pattern he had arranged with Deborah Powell. After a moment, he heard her voice from within. "Wayne, is that really you?" "It is me," Wayne called back. "It is safe now." The door opened to reveal Deborah's worried face, but her expression transformed to joy when she saw him standing there alive and unhurt. Behind her, Mark and Lewis came running, their faces bright with excitement. Quote 472, they shouted in unison, throwing themselves into his arms. Wayne knelt down and gathered his sons close, feeling their small bodies warm against his chest. The fear and exhaustion of the past few days melted away, replaced by the simple joy of being reunited with the people he loved most. "Good 473, Mark said, his voice muffled against Wayne's shoulder. "I promised I would," Wayne replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "And I always keep my promises to you." Lewis pulled back to look at his father's face. "Quote 476, quote 477, Wayne said firmly. Quote 478. Deborah Powell watched the reunion with tears in her eyes, her weathered face soft with maternal affection. She said gently, they spent the afternoon in the warm cabin, sharing a simple meal, while Wayne told an edited version of what had happened. The boys listened with wide eyes, but Wayne was careful to leave out the more violent details. They were too young to understand the full scope of the danger they had faced. As evening approached, Wayne found himself sitting by the fire with Deborah, while the twins played with wooden toys she had carved for them during their stay at the cabin. "Quote on 81, Deborah asked quietly. Wayne watched his sons, their faces glowing in the firelight. "Quote pound," he said. "Quote Fayan, quote font." Wayne looked at her with gratitude and respect. "Quote round," Deborah smiled. "Quote round 86. They talked late into the night, making plans for the future. The ranch would need work, but between Wayne's knowledge of the land and Deborah's business sense, they could make it prosper. More importantly, it would give Mark and Lewis a stable home where they could grow up safe and loved. As Wayne tucked his sons into their makeshift beds, Lewis reached up to touch his father's face. "Papa, will you tell us a story?" Wayne settled into a chair between their beds, thinking, "What kind of story would you like to hear?" "A story about a brave man," Mark said sleepily. Wayne smiled. "Once upon a time, there was a man who thought he had lost everything. He was alone and hungry and afraid, wandering in the mountains with nothing but the clothes on his back." The boys listened with rapt attention as Wayne wove a tale of kindness and courage, of strangers who became family, and of love that conquered fear. He told them about a woman with a generous heart who saw worth in someone the world had forgotten, and about how that single act of kindness changed everything. By the time he finished, both boys were fast asleep, their breathing slow and peaceful. Wayne sat watching them for a long time, marveling at their innocence and resilience. Tomorrow they would return to the ranch and begin building their new life. There would be challenges ahead, hard work, and difficult decisions. But tonight they were together and safe, and that was enough. Wayne thought about Heather King, the pregnant woman whose kindness had started this whole journey. He wondered where she was now, whether her baby had been born safely, whether she knew that her generosity had saved not just one life, but three. Someday, he promised himself, he would find her and tell her what her gift had meant. He would tell her about Mark and Lewis, about Deborah Powell, about the ranch they were building together. He would tell her that kindness was never wasted, that it rippled outward in ways the giver could never imagine. But that was for another day. Tonight was for gratitude and rest and the simple joy of being alive. Wayne kissed each of his sleeping sons on the forehead, then settled into his own bed. Outside, the wind whispered through the aspen trees, but inside the cabin, all was warm and peaceful. For the first time in months, Wayne Bennett slept without fear. Spring came early to the valley that year, melting the snow and revealing the rich earth beneath. Wayne stood in the doorway of the ranch house, watching Mark and Lewis chase chickens around the yard, while Deborah Powell tended her vegetable garden. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at the mine, and the transformation had been remarkable. The ranch was thriving under their combined efforts, with new fences, repaired buildings, and a small herd of cattle grazing in the pastures. But the most dramatic change was in Wayne himself. The hollow-eyed mountain man who had stumbled into Philip Murphy's store was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more confident. Good food, honest work, and the love of his family had restored him to health in body and spirit. "Just 491 IU," Mark called out, running toward the house with a handful of wildflowers. "Go to 492. Wayne knelt down to admire the colorful bouquet, noting how his son's face had filled out over the winter. Both boys were thriving in their new home, their laughter a constant source of joy. "They are beautiful," Wayne said. "Who are they for?" Aunt Deborah, Lewis announced, using the title the boys had naturally adopted for their guardian. She said flowers make everything prettier. Wayne smiled at his son's logic. Deborah Powell had indeed made everything prettier, bringing warmth and wisdom to their little family. The partnership between them had evolved into something deeper, a bond forged by shared hardship and mutual respect. Wayne agreed, Tom. Code 498, the boys ran off to present their gift, leaving Wayne alone with his thoughts. The morning mail had brought news from Sheriff Coleman about the ongoing investigation into Price's criminal organization. Several more arrests had been made, including corrupt officials in the territorial government. The network of thieves and murderers was finally being dismantled. But the letter had also contained something else, something that had been weighing on Wayne's mind all morning. A forwarding address for Heather King, the woman whose kindness had saved his life and the lives of his sons. Wayne had been trying to find her for weeks, wanting to thank her properly for what she had done. According to Coleman's information, she had given birth to a healthy daughter and was now living with her sister in a town called Millfield, about 50 miles to the south. The sound of an approaching wagon interrupted his thoughts. Wayne looked up to see Amy Bailey driving up the road, her face bright with excitement. Wayne, she called out as she brought the wagon to a stop. I have wonderful news. Wayne walked over to help his sister down from the wagon seat. What kind of news? Amy's eyes were sparkling with joy. Quote 502. Wayne stared at her in surprise. Quote 503, quote 504. Amy said, blushing slightly. Quote 505. Wayne felt a surge of happiness for his sister. Amy had been alone since her husband's death, devoted to caring for others but never allowing herself to find love again. Tell me about him, Wayne said. He is kind and intelligent, Amy said. He studied medicine back east but wanted to serve communities that needed doctors most. He has already helped so many people in town. Wayne could see the love in his sister's eyes, the same glow that had surrounded her during her first marriage. Amy said. Wayne felt tears prick his eyes. Quote 512 turn. They spent the afternoon planning for the wedding, with Deborah and the boys joining in the excited discussions. It would be a simple ceremony, but filled with love and joy. Dr. Chen would be joining them for dinner the next week, giving Wayne a chance to meet the man who had won his sister's heart. As evening approached and Amy prepared to return to town, Wayne found himself thinking again about Heather King. The woman who had shown him kindness when he needed it most deserved to know how her generosity had rippled outward, creating new life and new hope. Amy, Wayne said as she climbed back onto the wagon, I need to ask you a favor. Anything, she replied. Would you be willing to watch the boys for a few days? There is someone I need to visit, someone important. Amy's eyes lit up with understanding. Quote 517. Wayne nodded. Quote 51. Quote fine, and Amy said. Quote 5. 2 days later, Wayne set out for Millfield on horseback, carrying a letter he had written and rewritten a dozen times. The spring weather was perfect for traveling, with warm sunshine and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of new grass and wildflowers. The journey gave Wayne time to think about everything that had happened since that snowy day in Philip Murphy's store. The desperate mountain man who had begged for food was gone, replaced by someone with purpose and hope. He had a home, a family, and a future worth building. But none of it would have been possible without the compassion of a pregnant woman who had seen worth in a stranger. Millfield was a pleasant town nestled in a green valley, its streets lined with shade trees and well-tended gardens. Wayne found the address Sheriff Coleman had provided, a modest house with a white picket fence and roses climbing the front porch. Wayne dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post, his heart racing with nervous anticipation. What would he say to her? How could he possibly express the depth of his gratitude? Before he could lose his courage, Wayne walked up the path and knocked on the front door. After a moment, it opened to reveal a young woman with kind eyes and a baby in her arms. Yes, she said politely. I am looking for Heather King, Wayne said. My name is Wayne Bennett. The woman's eyes widened with recognition. Quote 524. Wayne nodded, surprised that she knew his name. Quote 525, the woman said. Quote 526. Wayne followed Sandra into a comfortable parlor where another woman sat by the window, nursing a baby. When she looked up, Wayne recognized her immediately despite the changes that motherhood had brought. Heather King looked healthy and radiant, her face glowing with the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. The baby in her arms was beautiful, with dark hair and bright, curious eyes. Quote 527, Heather said, her voice filled with wonder. Quote 528. Wayne removed his hat, suddenly feeling awkward and tongue-tied. Quote 529, he managed. Quote 530. Heather smiled, the same gentle expression he remembered from their first meeting. Wayne said firmly. He told her everything, starting with his journey down the mountain and ending with the ranch he now called home. He told her about Mark and Lewis, about Deborah Powell, about the life they were building together. He told her how her single act of kindness had saved not just his life, but the lives of his children. As he spoke, Heather's eyes filled with tears. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I had no idea, she said finally. I just saw a man who needed help. You saw more than that, Wayne said. You saw worth in someone the world had forgotten. You gave me hope when I had none left. Wayne reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter he had written. I brought you something, a small token of my gratitude. Heather opened the letter with trembling hands. Inside was not just Wayne's heartfelt thanks, but also a deed to a small piece of land adjacent to the ranch, enough for a homestead of her own if she ever wanted it. Quote 539. Heather protested. Quote 4 Wayne said gently. Quote 4 Sandra Jimenez looked at the deed with amazement. Quote 4 Quote 4 Wayne said. Quote 544. They spent the afternoon talking, sharing stories, and getting to know each other properly. Wayne learned that Heather had named her daughter Grace, a name that seemed perfect for a child born from an act of unexpected kindness. As evening approached and Wayne prepared to leave, Heather walked him to the door. She asked. Wayne replied. Heather reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and gentle. Quote 548, she said. Quote 549, quote 550, Wayne said. Quote 551. As Wayne rode away from Millfield, he felt a deep sense of completion. The circle that had begun in Philip Murphy's store was finally closed. The debt of gratitude had been acknowledged, the story told in full. But more than that, Wayne had gained something precious. The knowledge that goodness existed in the world, that people were capable of extraordinary compassion even in the darkest of times. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful, with the setting sun painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Wayne thought about the future, about the wedding he would attend, the crops he would plant, the children he would raise. It was a good life, built on the foundation of a stranger's kindness and nurtured by love and hard work. It was more than Wayne had ever dared to hope for during those desperate days on the mountain. As the ranch came into view, Wayne could see lights glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. Mark and Lewis would be waiting for him, probably with a dozen stories about their adventures with their Aunt Amy. Deborah would have dinner ready, the table set for their little family. Home. The word had new meaning now, representing not just a place but a feeling of belonging and security. Wayne urged his horse into a gallop, eager to be reunited with the people who mattered most. Behind him, the mountains stood silent and eternal, guardians of the valley where hope had taken root and flourished. The story that had begun with desperation and hunger had become one of redemption and joy. And at its heart was a simple truth that Wayne would carry with him always. Kindness was never wasted, love was never lost, and even in the darkest moments, there was always reason to hope. The wedding of Amy Bailey and Dr. Michael Chen was the social event of the season in Cedar Ridge. The entire town turned out to celebrate, filling the small church to capacity and spilling out onto the lawn beyond. Wayne stood at the altar beside his sister, his heart swelling with pride and joy. Amy looked radiant in her simple white dress, her face glowing with happiness as she gazed at her soon-to-be husband. Dr. Chen was a kind-faced man with gentle eyes, and Wayne could see why his sister had fallen in love with him. Mark and Lewis sat in the front pew with Deborah Powell, their faces scrubbed clean and their hair neatly combed for the occasion. They had been practicing their roles as ring bearers for weeks, and Wayne could see them fidgeting with nervous excitement. As the ceremony began, Wayne found his thoughts drifting to all the changes that had come to their family over the past year. From the depths of despair on the mountain to this moment of pure joy, the journey had been remarkable. Quote 552, the minister asked. Quote fire, as Wayne said, his voice strong and clear. He kissed Amy on the cheek and placed her hand in Dr. Chen's, symbolically entrusting her care to the man who would be her new partner in life. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of vows and rings and tears of happiness. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers and applause. At the reception that followed, Wayne found himself surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become like family over the past months. Sheriff Coleman was there with his wife, along with Judge Harrison and dozens of other people who had supported them through the difficult times. But the most meaningful moment came when Wayne spotted a familiar figure near the refreshment table. Heather King stood there with baby Grace in her arms, her sister Sandra beside her. "You came," Wayne said, approaching them with a smile. "I would not have missed it," Heather replied. "Besides, I wanted to see this famous ranch you have been telling me about." "And?" Wayne asked. Heather looked around at the celebration, at the faces filled with wine and laughter. "It is exactly what I imagined, a place where people care about each other." Sandra Jimenez bounced baby Grace in her arms, the infant gurgling happily at all the activity around her. "Heather has been thinking about your offer," she said quietly. Wayne raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Heather nodded, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "The deed you gave me, the land. I have been wondering if the offer is still open." "Of course it is," Wayne said immediately. "But what changed your mind?" "Watching you today," Heather said. "Seeing how you have built a life here, a real community. I want that for Grace. I want her to grow up somewhere she belongs." Wayne felt his heart leap with joy. Having Heather and her family nearby would complete the circle in a way he had not even dared to imagine. "When would you want to move?" he asked. "Soon," Heather said. "There is nothing keeping us in Millfield except habit. Sandra has been wanting a change too." They spent the rest of the evening making plans. Heather would sell her house in Millfield and use the proceeds to build a small home on the land Wayne had given her. Sandra would come with her, helping to care for Grace and perhaps starting a business of her own. As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Wayne found himself standing on the church steps with his extended family around him. Amy and Dr. Chen were preparing to leave for their honeymoon, while Mark and Louie dozed in Deborah's arms. Amy said, embracing her brother. Quote 570 your... Wayne hugged her tightly. Quote 571, he whispered. Quote 57. As Amy and her new husband drove away in their decorated buggy, Wayne gathered his sleeping sons and helped Deborah into their own wagon. The ride back to the ranch was quiet and peaceful, with the boys curled up between the adults and the stars shining brightly overhead. Deborah said softly, quote 574. Wayne agreed, quote 575. Deborah smiled, quote 576. Wayne looked at her with deep affection. Over the months, his relationship with Deborah had evolved from business partnership to something much deeper. She had become not just a friend, but a true companion, someone who shared his values and his vision for the future. Wayne said carefully, she turned to look at him, her eyes curious. Quote 579. Wayne took a deep breath, suddenly nervous. Quote 580. Deborah's eyes widened with understanding. Wayne Bennett, are you proposing to me? I suppose I am, Wayne said, his cheeks burning. I know it is not very romantic here in a wagon with two sleeping children between us, but I could not wait any longer to tell you how I feel. Deborah laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the valley. It is the most romantic proposal I have ever heard. And yes, Wayne Bennett, I will marry you. Wayne felt his heart soar as he leaned over to kiss her, careful not to disturb the sleeping boys. In that moment, surrounded by his family under the star-filled sky, Wayne felt complete in a way he had never experienced before. The ranch came into view as they crested the final hill, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Home. Not just a place, but a feeling, a sense of belonging that Wayne had thought he would never find again. As they pulled up to the house, Mark stirred in his sleep. Are we home, Papa? He mumbled. Yes, son, Wayne said, lifting the boy into his arms. We are home. 2 years later, Wayne stood in the same spot where he had first seen the ranch, but everything had changed. Where once there had been a single modest homestead, now there was a thriving community. The original ranch house had been expanded to accommodate Wayne's growing family, with Deborah, now his wife, and a new baby daughter named Hope sleeping in the nursery. Heather King's house sat on the hill overlooking the valley, where she lived with Grace and Sandra, who had opened a successful bakery that supplied the entire region. Mark and Lewis, now 6 years old, raced through the yard with Grace toddling behind them, her laughter ringing out like music. The boys had grown tall and strong, their faces tanned from long days spent helping with the ranch work. "Papa," Mark called out, running toward Wayne with excitement. "The new family is here." Wayne looked down the road to see a wagon approaching, loaded with furniture and belongings. Another family seeking a fresh start, drawn by the reputation of the community they had built in this remote valley. It had become a pattern over the past 2 years. Word had spread about the ranch and the people who lived there, attracting others who were looking for something more than just land to farm. They came seeking community, belonging, a place where their children could grow up safe and loved. Wayne and Deborah had welcomed them all, selling small parcels of land to families who shared their values. There was the young widow Megan Hughes with her 2 children, who had fled an abusive situation back east. There was the elderly couple who had lost their farm to drought and needed a place to spend their final years. There were young couples starting out, older folks looking for peace, and children who brought energy and joy to everything they touched. Each new arrival strengthened the community, adding their skills and stories to the growing tapestry of their shared life. "Who is it this time?" Deborah asked, joining Wayne on the porch with baby Hope in her arms. Wayne shaded his eyes against the sun, studying the approaching wagon. "A family from back east, according to the letter. The father is a carpenter, the mother a teacher. They have 3 children. We will need to expand the school again," Deborah said with a smile. Heather had started teaching the community's children in her home, but the growing number of families meant they would soon need a proper schoolhouse. "Quote Mentor," Wayne said. "Quote Byrt." The wagon pulled up in front of the house, and Wayne walked over to greet the new arrivals. The man who climbed down from the driver's seat was young and strong, with the calloused hands of someone who worked with wood. His wife looked tired from the long journey but hopeful, while their 3 children peered out from the wagon bed with wide eaches. "You must be the Donovan family," Wayne said, extending his hand. "I am Wayne Bennett. Welcome to Cedar Valley." They had named their community after the abundance of cedar trees that dotted the landscape, and the name had stuck. It was not officially recognized by any government, but to the people who lived there, it was as real as any town on any map. Wayne spent the afternoon helping the Donovans settle into the small cabin that had been prepared for them. The entire community pitched in, as had become their custom. Children played together while adults moved furniture and unpacked belongings, and by evening the new family was completely settled in. That night, as had become tradition, the entire community gathered for a welcome dinner. Long tables were set up in the meadow behind Wayne's house, laden with food that everyone had contributed. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the assembled faces. Wayne stood to address the group, looking out over the sea of friends and neighbors who had become his extended family. Mark and Lewis sat at his feet, while Deborah held baby Hope and smiled up at him with love and pride. Quote 597. Wayne began, his voice carrying across the meadow. Quote 598. He paused, looking at each face in turn. Heather King sat with Grace on her lap, the little girl now 3 years old and full of curiosity about the world around her. Sandra Jimenez was there with her new husband, a kind man she had met at one of their community gatherings. Megan Hughes had her children beside her, their faces bright with the security they had found in this place. Quote 599. Wayne continued. Quote 600. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Quote Sonen, and Wayne said. Quote so shitun. He looked down at his sons, remembering the desperate man he had been when he first held them as babies. Quote 603-1, he said. Quote 604. Wayne told them about that snowy day in Philip Murphy's store, about the pregnant woman who had spent her last coins to feed a stranger. He told them about the journey that had followed, the dangers and the triumphs, the people who had helped, and the enemies who had threatened everything they held dear. That woman's name was Heather King, Wayne said, turning to smile at her, and she is sitting right here among us tonight. The crowd turned to look at Heather, who blushed under the attention. Grace clapped her hands, not understanding the significance, but enjoying the excitement. Heather thought she was just buying bread for a hungry man, Wayne continued. But what she really did was plant a seed that grew into this community, this family, this life we all share. Wayne reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden figure, the same carved bear that he had tried to trade for food all those years ago. He had kept it as a reminder of how far he had come. "My father taught me to carve," Wayne said, holding up the figure. "He told me that every piece of wood has something beautiful hidden inside it. You just have to care enough to find it and patient enough to bring it out." He looked around at the assembled faces, seeing the truth of his father's words reflected in every one of them. Quote 611 mile, Wayne said. Quote 612. Wayne sat down, and for a moment the meadow was silent, except for the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of nightbirds. Then Mark stood up, his young voice clear and strong. Quote 613. Wayne nodded encouragingly, curious about what his son wanted to share. Quote 644, Mark said as quote 614. The boy looked around at the gathered community, his face serious beyond his years. Quote 6, Mark continued. Quote 617 when Lewis stood up beside his brother, not to be outdone. Quote 618 the crowd laughed at the boy's earnest enthusiasm, and the serious mood lightened into something warmer and more joyful. As the evening progressed, people shared their own stories and dreams. The carpenter talked about the workshop he wanted to build. The teacher discussed plans for expanding the school. The baker described new recipes she wanted to try. But underlying all the practical discussions was something deeper, a shared commitment to the values that had brought them together. Kindness, generosity, hard work, and mutual support. These were the foundations on which their community was built. As the gathering wound down and families began to drift back to their homes, Wayne found himself walking with Heather through the quiet meadow. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Spending that money on a stranger?" Heather laughed softly, adjusting Grace's weight in her arms as the little girl dozed against her shoulder. Quote 621, quote 622, quote 623, Heather said. Quote 624, Wayne smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. The arithmetic of kindness was impossible to calculate in conventional terms, but its value was beyond measure. They reached Heather's house, where Sandra was waiting on the porch with a warm smile. The three women had become as close as sisters, bound together by their shared journey to this place of peace and plenty. "Good night, Wayne," Heather said. "Thank you for the story tonight. It is important that people know how all this started." "Good night," Wayne replied. "Sleep well." Wayne walked back to his own house where Deborah was waiting for him on the porch. She had put baby Hope to bed and was enjoying the quiet evening air. "The boys are asleep," she said as he sat down beside her. "They were so excited about the new family that I thought they would never settle down." Wayne put his arm around his wife, drawing her close. "They love having new friends to play with. This place is good for children." "It is good for everyone," Deborah said. "I never imagined when I offered you that partnership that it would lead to all this." They sat in comfortable silence, looking out over the valley that had become their world. Lights glowed in windows, scattered across the landscape, each one representing a family that had found safety and belonging in this remote corner of the mountains. "Wayne," Deborah said softly, "do you think we have done enough? Built enough? Helped enough people?" Wayne considered the question seriously. "I do not think there is ever enough kindness in the world," he said finally. "But I think we have made a good start." "What comes next?" Wayne smiled, thinking about all the possibilities that lay ahead. More families, more children, more stories. Maybe a proper town eventually, with a post office and a church and all the things that make a place feel permanent. And if it gets too big, if we lose the feeling that makes this place special, then we will have to trust the people who come after us to preserve what we have built, Wayne said. That is what communities do. They pass their values from one generation to the next. Deborah nodded, satisfied with his answer. "I love you, Wayne Bennett." "I love you too," Wayne replied, kissing the top of her head. As they sat together on the porch, Wayne thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the depths of despair to the heights of joy, from isolation to community, from hopelessness to a future bright with possibility. It had all started with a simple act of kindness from a stranger who saw worth in someone the world had forgotten. That kindness had rippled outward, touching life after life, creating something beautiful and lasting. Wayne looked up at the stars shining brightly in the clear mountain sky, the same stars that had watched over him during his darkest hours. But now they seemed to shine with promise rather than indifference, illuminating a world where goodness was possible and love could triumph over fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be crops to plant, buildings to construct, children to teach, and newcomers to welcome. The work of building a community was never finished, but it was work that gave life meaning and purpose. Wayne closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of his world, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft breathing of his sleeping family. These were the sounds of home, of peace, of a life well lived. In the morning, he would wake to find Mark and Lewis bouncing on his bed, eager to start another day of adventure. He would have breakfast with his wife and daughter, check on the animals, and begin whatever tasks the day required. But tonight, Wayne Bennett was content to sit in the darkness and marvel at the miracle of his existence. He had been saved by kindness, sustained by love, and surrounded by people who had chosen to build something beautiful together. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for, and it was enough. The letter arrived on a crisp autumn morning, carried by a traveling merchant who made regular stops at Cedar Valley. Wayne was repairing a fence when Deborah called to him from the porch, waving the envelope in her hand. "It is from Sheriff Coleman," she said as Wayne approached. "He says it is important." Wayne wiped his hands on his work clothes and took the letter, noting the official seal of the territorial government. Inside, Coleman's familiar handwriting conveyed news that made Wayne's heart race. "What is it?" Deborah asked, seeing the expression on his face. "The territorial legislature is considering granting us official township status," Wayne read aloud. "They want to send a delegation to evaluate our community and determine if we meet the requirements." Deborah's eyes widened. Quote 650. Wayne nodded, his mind racing through the implications. Official recognition would bring benefits: federal mail service, legal protection, access to territorial funds for infrastructure, but it would also bring oversight, regulations, and the possibility of outside interference in the way they had chosen to live. Deborah asked. Wayne scanned the letter again. That evening, Wayne called a community meeting in the meadow where they had welcomed so many new families. The entire population of Cedar Valley gathered, nearly 50 people now, representing 15 families and a handful of single adults who had found their place in the growing community. Wayne stood before them, the letter from Sheriff Coleman in his hand, and explained the situation. When he finished, the meadow buzzed with excited conversation. Quote 653, asked Thomas Donovan, the carpenter who had become one of the community's most respected members. "It means we have a choice to make," Wayne replied. "We can pursue official recognition and accept the changes that come with it, or we can remain as we are, independent but unrecognized." Heather King raised her hand. "What are the advantages of township status?" Wayne had been researching the question since receiving Coleman's letter. Quote 657. Quote 658. Asked Sandra Jimenez. Quote 659, Sir. The discussion that followed was passionate but respectful, reflecting the democratic values that had guided the community from its founding. Some favored pursuing official recognition, seeing it as the natural next step in their growth. Others preferred to maintain their independence, fearing that government involvement would destroy the unique character of their community. Megan Hughes, the young widow who had found safety in Cedar Valley, spoke for many when she said, quote 660, quote, but Thomas Donovan offered a counter-argument. Quote 661. The debate continued for hours, with Wayne serving as moderator rather than advocate. He had learned that the best decisions came from allowing everyone to voice their concerns and work toward consensus. Finally, as the evening grew late, Wayne called for a preliminary vote to gauge the community's feelings. The result was closer than he had expected. 26 in favor of pursuing township status, 24 opposed. "We are clearly divided," Wayne said. "I suggest we take a month to consider this question more carefully. The delegation will not arrive until then, and we can use that time to gather more information and discuss our concerns." The crowd agreed, and people began to drift back to their homes, continuing their conversations in smaller groups. Wayne found himself walking with Heather and Deborah, the three of them deep in thought about the decision facing their community. "What do you think we should do?" Heather asked. Wayne was quiet for a long moment. "I think we should trust the process that has brought us this far," he said finally. "We have always made decisions together, as a community. Whatever we choose, we will choose it together." Over the following weeks, the debate continued in kitchens and workshops, around dinner tables, and in chance encounters on the roads between houses. Wayne found himself pulled in different directions by valid arguments on both sides. The turning point came when a second letter arrived, this one from an unexpected source. Philip Murphy, the store owner, who had refused to help Wayne years earlier, wrote to warn them about the territorial delegation. "The men coming to evaluate your community are not interested in your success," Murphy wrote. "They represent business interests that see your independence as a threat to their control over trade and development in the region. They will find reasons to deny your application unless you agree to certain accommodations that would benefit their associates." The letter went on to detail a pattern of corruption and favoritism in the territorial government, where official recognition was often granted or denied based on political considerations rather than merit. Wayne shared Murphy's letter with the community leaders, and the revelation changed the nature of their debate. The question was no longer whether they wanted government recognition, but whether they could trust the government to treat them fairly. Quote 669, Wayne said during an emergency meeting of the community council. Quote 670, Heather nodded grimly. Quote 671, Thomas Donovan looked troubled. Quote 672, Wayne had been wrestling with the same dilemma, but Philip Murphy's letter had crystallized his thinking. "I think we need to approach this differently," he said. "Instead of asking whether we want government recognition, we should ask what we are willing to sacrifice to get it." The discussion that followed was sobering. The community had prospered precisely because it operated outside the conventional systems of territorial governance. They had no formal laws, only agreed upon principles. They had no official leaders, only people who took responsibility for specific tasks. They had no rigid social hierarchy, only mutual respect and shared purpose. All of that could be threatened by the requirements of official township status. When the territorial delegation arrived the following month, Cedar Valley was ready for them. The community had voted unanimously to decline pursuit of township status, choosing independence over recognition. The three-man delegation was led by a pompous official named Harrison Fletcher, who seemed determined to find fault with everything he saw. His companions were a surveyor and a clerk, both of whom appeared more interested in the community's potential for exploitation than its actual achievements. Wayne met them at the edge of the valley, accompanied by Thomas Donovan and Heather King as representatives of the community council. Wayne said politely, Fletcher's face reddened with indignation, "You cannot simply withdraw your application. The territorial government has invested time and resources in this evaluation." "We never submitted an application," Wayne replied calmly. "Sheriff Coleman mentioned that we might be eligible, but we have decided that official recognition is not in our best interests." "That is a foolish decision," Fletcher blustered. "Without territorial protection, you have no legal standing. Your land claims could be challenged, your businesses could be shut down, your children could be denied access to territorial schools." Wayne exchanged glances with his companions. Fletcher's threats confirmed everything Philip Murphy had warned them about. Wayne said Fletcher's surveyor had been studying the valley through a spyglass, and now he whispered something in his superior's ear. Fletcher's expression grew even more hostile. "I see you have built quite an extensive settlement here," he said. "Roads, bridges, multiple dwellings, all without proper permits or oversight. The territorial government takes a dim view of unauthorized development. Is there a law requiring permits for private development on private land?" Heather asked sweetly. The clerk consulted a thick book of regulations, flipping through pages with obvious frustration. "Well, no, not specifically, but there are guidelines about community planning and environmental impact." "Guidelines are not laws," Thomas Donovan observed. "And as Mr. Bennett said, we operate within territorial law." The confrontation continued for several hours, with Fletcher and his men becoming increasingly aggressive in their attempts to find legal vulnerabilities in the community's operations. But Wayne and his companions had prepared well, consulting with lawyers in the territorial capital and ensuring that every aspect of their community complied with existing regulations. Finally, Fletcher gave up the pretense of official evaluation and revealed his true purpose. He said, Wayne felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same rage he had felt when confronted by Mark Sanders and Kevin Price. Once again, powerful men were trying to take what his community had built through honest work and sacrifice. Quote 692, Wayne said firmly. Quote 6932, Fletcher replied with a cold smile. Quote 694, quote 695 Tana, Wayne said. Quote 6961, then Fletcher's mask of civility finally slipped completely. You are making a serious mistake, Bennett. The territorial government has ways of dealing with communities that refuse to cooperate. Tax assessments, regulatory investigations, eminent domain proceedings. We can make your life very difficult. Wayne stepped closer to Fletcher, his voice low and dangerous. Let me tell you something about difficult lives, Mr. Fletcher. I have been hungry and homeless and hunted by men who wanted me dead. I have faced down killers and survived winters that would break most men. Your threats do not frighten me. Wayne gestured toward the valley below, where children played in the yards while their parents worked in gardens and workshops. These people came here seeking something better than the world you represent. Yeah, they found it and they will fight to keep it, not with guns or violence, but with the strength that comes from knowing they are right. Fletcher and his companions left that afternoon, their mission a complete failure. But Wayne knew they would be back, in one form or another. The forces that Fletcher represented did not give up easily when there was money to be made. That evening, the community gathered once again in the meadow to hear about the confrontation. When Wayne finished his account, the response was unanimous. They had made the right choice in rejecting government recognition. We are stronger on our own, declared Megan Hughes. We do not need their approval to know what we have accomplished. But we need to be prepared for their return, added Thomas Donovan. Men like Fletcher do not accept defeat gracefully. Wayne nodded. We will be ready. We have survived worse than corrupt bureaucrats and greedy businessmen. As the meeting broke up, Wayne found himself once again walking with Heather through the quiet valley. Grace was now 4 years old, running ahead of them on the path while chattering about her day at the community and school. Do you think we made the right choice? Heather asked. Wayne looked around at the peaceful scene, houses glowing with warm light, families gathering for evening meals, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting on the night air. Yes, he said without hesitation. We built this place with our own hands and our own hearts. We do not need anyone's permission to call it home. Heather smiled. Grace will grow up free here the way children should grow up. That is worth more than any government recognition. Wayne thought about his own sons, now 8 years old and full of confidence and curiosity. They had never known the fear and uncertainty that had marked his own childhood. They had grown up in a place where they were valued and protected, where their dreams were encouraged and their mistakes were forgiven. That was the true measure of their community's success, not in official recognition or economic development, but in the quality of life they had created for their children. As Wayne tucked Mark and Lewis into bed that night, he reflected on how far they had all come from that desperate day in Philip Murphy's store. The starving mountain man and his frightened children had found not just survival, but prosperity, not just shelter, but home. Papa, Mark said sleepily, are the bad men going to come back? Wayne smoothed his son's hair, remembering all the bad men they had faced and overcome. Wayne said, Lewis rolled over in his bed. Quote 716, he announced. Quote 717, Wayne smiled at his son's simple wisdom. You are absolutely right. Good people are always stronger than bad people because good people help each other. As Wayne left the boys' room and prepared for bed himself, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from a day well lived and a choice well made. They had faced a test of their values and principles, and they had passed. Cedar Valley would continue to grow and prosper, not because of government recognition or outside investment, but because of the character of the people who called it home. They had chosen independence over security, principle over profit, and community over individual gain. It was the kind of choice that defined not just a place but a people. And Wayne Bennett, once a desperate man with nothing to lose, now knew himself to be rich beyond measure in the things that truly mattered. The story that had begun with an act of kindness had become a testament to the power of ordinary people to create something extraordinary when they work together with love and purpose. And it was far from over. 5 years had passed since the territorial delegation's visit, and Cedar Valley had not only survived, but thrived in its independence. The community now boasted nearly 100 residents, with new families arriving each season, drawn by stories of the peaceful settlement nestled in the mountains. Wayne stood on the hill overlooking the valley, watching the morning bustle of a place that had grown beyond his wildest dreams. The original ranch house was now the center of a small town, complete with a proper school, a church, a general store, and a dozen other businesses that served both the community and travelers passing through the region. Mark and Lewis, now 13 years old, were helping Thomas Donovan construct a new workshop for the growing carpentry business. The boys had inherited their father's work ethic and their mother's intelligence, becoming leaders among the community's young people. Baby Hope was no longer a baby, but a spirited 5-year-old who followed her older brothers everywhere, determined not to be left out of any adventure. She had her mother's gentle nature, but her father's stubborn streak, a combination that promised interesting challenges in the years ahead. Quote 719, Deborah asked, joining Wayne on the hill with a cup of coffee for each of them. Wayne accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his arms around his wife as they watched their world wake up. Quote 720, he said. Quote 721, Deborah teased. Quote 722, Wayne laughed. Quote 723. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Heather King emerge from her house to tend the garden that had become famous throughout the region for its productivity. Grace, now 9 years old, was beside her as always, learning the skills that would serve her well in the years to come. Sandra Jimenez and her husband were opening their bakery for the morning rush, the aroma of fresh bread already drifting across the valley. Their business had grown so successful that they were considering opening a second location in a neighboring town. Megan Hughes was walking toward the school building, her arms full of books and supplies for another day of teaching. Her own children were among the students, along with dozens of others who were receiving an education that rivaled anything available in the territorial capital. Quote 724 tone, Deborah said softly. Quote 725. Wayne looked at her, noting the serious tone in her voice. Quote 727, she said, her face glowing with happiness and nervousness. Wayne felt his heart skip a beat. At 42, he had not expected to become a father again. But the news filled him with joy rather than concern. He asked. Deborah replied. Wayne pulled her close, kissing her with all the love and gratitude he felt. Quote 731, he whispered. Quote 732. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A small group of riders was making its way up the valley road, their pace unhurried, but purposeful. Wayne recognized the lead rider immediately, Sheriff Coleman, now graying at the temples but still straight in the saddle. Deborah observed. Wayne nodded, already walking down the hill to meet them. Coleman's visits were always welcome, but they usually meant news from the outside world, not all of it good. The sheriff dismounted as Wayne approached, his weathered face creased with a smile. Wayne Bennett, he said, extending his hand. You look prosperous. I look happy, Wayne corrected, shaking his old friend's hand. Quote 737 Shem, Coleman laughed. Quote 738. Wayne gestured toward the bustling community around them. Quote 739. Quote 740. Coleman said, his expression growing serious. Quote 741. Wayne felt a familiar knot of tension form in his stomach. Quote 742. Quote 743. Coleman explained. Quote 744. Wayne raised an eyebrow. Quote 745. Quote 746. Coleman agreed. Quote 747. Wayne felt his heart sink. Quote 748. Quote 749. Coleman said. Quote 750. Wayne stared at his old friend, hardly believing what he was hearing. Coleman explained. Wayne's mind raced as he considered the implications. What is the catch? Coleman smiled. No catch. The new administration recognizes that communities like yours represent the best of what the territory can become. They want to support you, not control you. And you trust this new governor? I helped investigate the old administration, Coleman said. I know who the honest people are and who the corrupt ones were. Governor Mitchell is one of the good ones. He genuinely believes in local self-determination and limited government interference. Wayne looked around at the community that had grown from nothing into something remarkable. Official recognition would provide security and opportunities for future growth, but it would also mean accepting oversight from people who might not understand or appreciate what they had built. I will need to discuss this with the community, Wayne said finally. Of course, Coleman agreed. Take all the time you need. The offer will remain open indefinitely. That evening, Wayne called another community meeting in the meadow that had become their traditional gathering place. The crowd was much larger now, representing the growth and diversity of their settlement. Wayne explained Coleman's offer, outlining both the benefits and the potential risks of accepting official municipal status. The discussion that followed was thoughtful and thorough, reflecting the democratic values that had guided the community from its founding. Quote 762 on asked one of the newer residents, a man who had fled political persecution in his home state. Quote 763, Wayne admitted. Quote 7640, Heather King stood to address the crowd. Quote 765, she said. Quote 766, Thomas Donovan nodded in agreement. And quote 767, y'all, but Megan Hughes voiced the concerns of those who remained skeptical. Quote 768, she said on. Quote 769, the debate continued for hours, with passionate arguments on both sides. Wayne found himself torn between his natural caution and his desire to provide the best possible future for his children and the community they would inherit. Finally, as the evening grew late, Wayne called for a preliminary vote. The result was overwhelming. 47 in favor of accepting municipal status, only 8 opposed. Quote, Wayne said, quote, 717. The crowd murmured agreement, and Wayne felt a surge of pride in the community they had created. These people had learned to make difficult decisions together, to respect dissenting opinions while working toward common goals. Wayne said, quote 773. The cheer that went up from the crowd echoed across the valley, a sound of celebration and hope that seemed to promise even brighter days ahead. Over the following months, the process of incorporation moved forward smoothly. Governor Mitchell proved to be as good as his word, allowing Cedar Valley to maintain its unique character while providing the legal framework for continued growth and development. The community elected Wayne as their first official mayor, a position he accepted reluctantly, but performed with the same dedication he brought to everything else. Heather King became the town clerk. Thomas Donovan was elected to the town council, and Megan Hughes was appointed as the official school superintendent. The changes were mostly symbolic, formalizing relationships and responsibilities that had existed informally for years. But the psychological impact was significant. Cedar Valley was no longer just a collection of families living together, but an official community with standing under territorial law. The benefits became apparent almost immediately. Federal mail service was established, connecting the community to the wider world in ways that had been impossible before. A territorial judge began holding court sessions in Cedar Valley, providing legal services to residents throughout the region. Most importantly, the community gained protection against the kind of predatory schemes that Harrison Fletcher had represented. No longer could corrupt officials or greedy businessmen threaten their existence with impunity. As Wayne stood once again on the hill overlooking the valley, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From desperate survival to thriving community, from isolation to integration, from fear to hope. The story that had begun with Heather King's simple act of kindness had become something larger than any of them could have imagined. It had become proof that ordinary people, working together with love and determination, could create something extraordinary. But perhaps most importantly, it had become a legacy for the children who would inherit this place and carry its values forward into an uncertain future. Wayne thought about the new baby that would arrive in the spring, adding another voice to the chorus of young people who called Cedar Valley home. That child would grow up in a place of security and opportunity, surrounded by people who believed in the power of community and the importance of caring for one another. It was a gift beyond price, paid for with years of hard work and sacrifice, but rooted in the simple truth that kindness was never wasted and love was never lost. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Wayne Bennett smiled and headed home to his family, carrying with him the deep satisfaction of a life well lived in a community well built. The best was yet to come. The morning of the spring festival dawned clear and bright, with wildflowers blooming in the meadows and children's laughter echoing across the valley. Cedar Valley had grown to nearly 200 residents now, making it one of the largest communities in the territorial region. Wayne stood with Deborah at the edge of the celebration, watching their newest daughter sleep peacefully in her mother's arms. Little Faith had arrived exactly on schedule, bringing joy and renewed purpose to their growing family. Mark and Lewis, now 15, were helping organize games for the younger children, while Hope, 7 years old and full of energy, raced between the various activities with Grace King and a dozen other friends. "Hard to believe it has been 10 years since we first came here," Deborah said, adjusting Faith's blanket against the cool mountain breeze. Wayne nodded, his eyes taking in the scene before them. Where once there had been only wilderness, now there was a thriving town complete with paved streets, gas lighting, and even plans for a railroad spur that would connect them to the territorial capital. But despite all the modern improvements, the heart of Cedar Valley remained unchanged. Families still gathered for community meals, neighbors still helped each other through difficult times, and children still grew up feeling safe and loved. Quote 775, a familiar voice called out behind them. Wayne turned to see Heather King approaching, her face radiant with excitement. Grace walked beside her, now 14 years old, and already showing signs of the strong, independent woman she would become. Quote 7761, Wayne said warmly. Quote 777 on, quote is 778. Heather replied, her eyes sparkling. Quote is 779. Wayne felt a surge of happiness for his old friend. Dr. Martinez had arrived in Cedar Valley the previous year to establish a medical practice, and his courtship of Heather had been the subject of much gentle teasing from the community. Quote 780, Deborah said, reaching out to embrace Heather with her free arm. Quote 78 and so on. Quote is 782, Heather said. Quote is 783. Wayne felt tears prick his eyes. Quote upon 704. As they talked about wedding plans, Wayne's attention was drawn to a commotion near the main road. A group of riders was approaching the festival, their pace urgent despite the celebratory atmosphere. Wayne recognized the lead rider immediately. It was one of the territorial marshals who occasionally passed through Cedar Valley on official business. But the man's expression was grim, suggesting that this was not a social visit. Wayne said to the women walking over to meet the marshal. Quote 786, Shaw, the marshal said, dismounting from his horse. Quote 787, Fawn. Wayne felt a familiar knot of tension form in his stomach. Quote 788. Quote 789, the marshal said simply. Quote 790. Wayne stared at the man, hardly believing what he was hearing. The distant conflict that had been raging in the eastern states had finally reached their peaceful valley. Quote 791, Wayne asked. Quote 792, Han, the marshal replied. Quote 793. Wayne's mind raced as he considered the implications. Many of the community's young men would be affected by the call to service, including his own sons who were approaching military age. Wayne said. The marshal nodded. Upon a 795, Wayne walked back to the festival, his heart heavy with the burden of the news he carried. The celebration continued around him, but he could see that word was already spreading. Conversations grew quieter, faces more serious, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Wayne climbed onto the platform that had been erected for the festival speeches and called for attention. The crowd gathered quickly, sensing the gravity of the moment. Quote 796, Wayne began, his voice carrying across the meadow. Quote 797, murmur of shock and concern rippled through the crowd. Wayne could see fear in the faces of wives and mothers, determination in the eyes of young men who had never faced such a challenge. But Carter 98, Wayne continued. Quote 799, Thomas Donovan stepped forward from the crowd. Get on 800. It was a practical question that went to the heart of their concerns. Cedar Valley had prospered because of the hard work and dedication of its residents. Losing a significant portion of the workforce to military service would create serious challenges. Wayne said, though he was not entirely sure how. Quote 802. A young man named James Peterson, one of the newer residents, raised his hand. Quote 803. The territorial marshal stepped forward to answer. Quote 800 for Bon. Wayne felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him. These people had trusted him to guide their community through good times and bad, and now he faced perhaps the greatest challenge of his tenure as mayor. Quote 805 Wayne said. Quote 806 pound. The crowd began to disperse, families gathering together to talk through the implications of the marshal's news. Wayne found himself surrounded by community leaders who looked to him for guidance. What are you thinking? Heather asked quietly. Wayne looked around at the faces of his friends and neighbors, seeing the same mix of fear and determination that had carried them through previous challenges. I am thinking that we have built something worth fighting for, he said. The question is whether we fight for it here or on some distant battlefield. That evening, Wayne sat on his porch with Deborah, watching their children play in the yard while baby Faith slept in her mother's arms. The normalcy of the scene seemed surreal given the day's revelations. What are you going to do? Deborah asked softly. Wayne had been wrestling with that question all afternoon. At 37, he was still young enough to be subject to military service, but old enough to have responsibilities that would be difficult to abandon. I do not know, he admitted. Part of me feels obligated to serve, to do my part in preserving the union that has protected our way of life. But another part of me knows that this community needs experienced leadership to survive the challenges ahead. Deborah was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the wisdom that had drawn him to her in the first place. You have already served, Wayne. You served when you fought Sanders and Price to protect your family. You served when you helped build this community from nothing. You served when you accepted the responsibility of leadership. Wayne looked at his wife with gratitude and love. You think I should stay? I think you should do what your heart tells you is right, Deborah replied. But I also think this community needs you more than the Union Army does. Wayne nodded, feeling the truth of her words. He had responsibilities here that went beyond his own desires or sense of duty. Hundreds of people depended on the leadership and stability he provided. But that did not make the decision any easier. The next evening's meeting was the largest in the community's history, with nearly every adult resident in attendance. The mood was somber but determined, reflecting the serious nature of the decisions they faced. Wayne stood before them, having spent the day in consultation with community leaders and territorial officials. I have been in contact with the territorial government about our situation, he began. There are provisions for essential personnel to remain in their civilian roles, but those decisions must be made carefully and justified thoroughly. Thomas Donovan raised his hand. What qualifies as essential? Law enforcement, medical personnel, teachers, and community leaders whose departure would cause significant hardship, Wayne replied. The territorial government recognizes that communities like ours serve important strategic purposes and should not be abandoned. A young farmer named David Chen, Dr. Martinez's nephew, stood up. Quote 822 while Wayne shook his head. Quote 823. The discussion that followed was emotional but respectful, with families sharing their fears and hopes for the future. Some of the younger men expressed eagerness to serve their country, while others felt torn between duty to the Union and responsibility to their families. In the end, 12 men volunteered for military service, while the rest were deemed essential to the community's survival. Wayne accepted appointment as the town's chief law enforcement officer, a role that would exempt him from military service while allowing him to continue his leadership responsibilities. The volunteers left Cedar Valley 3 weeks later, amid tears and prayers and promises to return safely. Wayne stood with the rest of the community to see them off, feeling the weight of responsibility for those who remained. Quote 824, he promised the departing men. Quote 825 almost. As the wagons carrying the volunteers disappeared over the horizon, Wayne felt the community close ranks around him. The war might take their young men away, but it would not break the bonds that held them together. The months that followed were challenging but not impossible. Women took over many of the roles previously filled by men, while older residents and teenagers stepped up to fill other gaps. The community's resilience, forged through years of shared struggle, proved equal to this new test. Letters arrived regularly from the volunteers, describing their training and eventual deployment to battlefields whose names became familiar through newspaper reports. The community followed the progress of the war with intense interest, knowing that their friends and family members were part of the great struggle for the nation's future. But life in Cedar Valley continued, adapted to new circumstances, but fundamentally unchanged. Children still went to school, crops were still planted and harvested, and babies were still born to families that welcomed them with joy. Wayne found himself busier than ever, serving not just as mayor and law enforcement officer, but as counselor, mediator, and father figure to a community that had lost many of its young men to war. It was during this period that he received a letter that would change everything once again. The letter came from Washington, D.C., bearing the seal of the War Department. Wayne opened it with trembling hands, fearing news about one of their volunteers. Instead, he found an offer that took his breath away. The federal government was establishing a new program to support communities in the Western Territories, recognizing their strategic importance in maintaining stability during the war. Cedar Valley had been selected as a model community, and Wayne was being offered a position as a territorial administrator with responsibility for overseeing similar settlements throughout the region. The position would come with significant resources: federal funding for infrastructure improvements, military protection against Confederate raiders, and support for expanding the community's role as a regional center. But it would also require Wayne to travel extensively, leaving Cedar Valley for months at a time to establish and supervise other communities. Wayne read the letter 3 times, hardly believing what he was seeing. It was an honor beyond anything he had imagined, recognition of what they had accomplished in their remote valley. But it was also a test of his priorities and values. That evening, Wayne shared the letter with Deborah and the community leaders, watching their faces as they absorbed the implications of the offer. "This is incredible," Heather said. "Federal recognition of what we have built here. And federal resources to build something even better," added Thomas Donovan. But Wayne could see the concern in Deborah's eyes, the same worry he felt in his own heart. He said, Deborah asked. Wayne consulted the letter again. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated what this would mean. Wayne had been the community's leader for so long that it was difficult to imagine Cedar Valley without him. "You have to take it," Heather said finally. "This is bigger than just our community. You could help create dozens of places like this, hundreds of families who could find the same peace and prosperity we have found." Wayne looked at his old friend with gratitude and admiration. Even now, after all these years, Heather King's first instinct was to think about helping others. Quote 835. Thomas Donovan asked. Quote 86. It was the question Wayne had been asking himself since receiving the letter. He had been so central to the community's development that his absence might create a leadership vacuum that could threaten everything they had built. "The community is stronger than any one person," Wayne said, though he was not entirely convinced of his own words. "We have capable leaders who could step up to fill the role." "Could, but should they have to?" Deborah asked quietly. Wayne looked at his wife, seeing the conflict in her eyes. She understood the importance of the opportunity, but she also understood what it would cost their family. "I need time to think about this," Wayne said finally, "and I need to discuss it with my family." The meeting broke up with no decision made, but Wayne could see that the community was already beginning to grapple with the possibility of his departure. That night, Wayne sat on his porch with Deborah, watching the stars shine over their peaceful valley. Babyface slept in her mother's arms, while the older children played quietly in the yard. Deborah asked, echoing the advice she had given him before. Wayne was quiet for a long moment. He said finally, Deborah prompted. Wayne continued. Quote 47. Deborah nodded, understanding the weight of the decision he faced. Quote 48. Quote 49, Wayne said. Quote 50. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Deborah spoke again. She asked. Wayne smiled, remembering the conversation from years earlier. Deborah said, quote 855. Wayne felt tears sting his eyes as he recognized the truth in his wife's words. The story that had begun with a simple act of compassion could continue, spreading hope and healing to places that needed it most. But the cost would be immense, both for him and for the family he would leave behind. I cannot make this decision alone, Wayne said. It affects all of us. Then we will make it together, Deborah replied, as we have made every important decision since we met. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Wayne's life. He and Deborah talked through every aspect of the opportunity, weighing the benefits against the costs, considering the impact on their children and their community. By morning, they had reached a decision that surprised them both. Wayne would accept the position, but only under certain conditions. He would serve for 1 year initially, using that time to establish the program and train local leaders in other communities. After that, he would return to Cedar Valley and work as a regional consultant, providing guidance and support without the extensive travel requirements. It was a compromise that would allow him to contribute to the larger cause while maintaining his commitment to his family and community. When Wayne presented this proposal to the War Department, they accepted it immediately. The federal government was more interested in his expertise and experience than in his long-term availability. And so it was that Wayne Bennett, the man who had once begged for bread in a mountain store, found himself appointed as a federal administrator with responsibility for establishing and supporting communities throughout the Western Territories. The irony was not lost on him. The same government that had once threatened to destroy his community was now asking him to help create others like it. But perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all, that change was possible, that good people could overcome bad systems, and that hope could triumph over fear if given the chance. As Wayne prepared to leave Cedar Valley for his new role, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment, from desperation to prosperity, from isolation to influence, from a man with nothing to lose to one with everything to protect. The story was far from over, but this chapter was complete, and it had been written with the same values that had guided him from the beginning: kindness, courage, and an unshakable belief in the power of ordinary people to create something extraordinary. The mountain man who had been saved by a stranger's compassion was now in a position to save others, carrying forward the legacy of that first act of kindness to places and people he had never imagined. It was a responsibility he would not take lightly and a trust he would not betray. The future was bright with possibility, and Wayne Bennett was ready to meet it.